Hey guys, tonight we step back into a sweltering American summer somewhere around 1842, where the air hangs thick as wet wool, and the sun beats down on cobblestone streets that seem to radiate heat back into your bones. You're standing in a city, could be Philadelphia, could be New York, could be Baltimore, and you're thirsty. Desperately, achingly thirsty. The kind of thirst that makes you dream of plunging your whole head into a cool mountain stream. But here's the thing. That well on the corner, the one everyone's been drawing water from all summer, it smells faintly of something you'd rather not think about. And the river? Let's just say you've seen things floating in it that suggest drinking from it might be the last decision you ever make. You probably won't survive this summer if you make the wrong choice about what passes your lips. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love knowing who's drifting off with me tonight from what corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The heat has been building for 3 weeks now. You've counted. Each morning you wake hoping for clouds, for a merciful thunderstorm, for anything that might break this relentless, suffocating blanket of summer. But the sky remains a pale, hazy blue. And by noon the temperature has climbed to something that makes even breathing feel like effort. Your shirt clings to your back, your collar is a damp ring around your neck, and everywhere you go you see the same exhausted expressions, the same slow movements of people conserving what little energy they have left. This is the 1840s, remember? No air conditioning, no refrigerators humming quietly in the corner, no plastic bottles of purified spring water waiting in convenience store coolers. You live in an age where summer isn't just uncomfortable, it's genuinely dangerous. People die from the heat itself, yes, but far more die from what they drink trying to escape it. You make your way down the main street of whatever city you've found yourself in, and the signs of summer distress are everywhere. A horse stands listlessly at a trough, barely bothering to drink. Children who should be running and playing sit in whatever patches of shade they can find, too wilted to cause their usual mischief. A woman fans herself on a doorstep, her movements mechanical and slow. Everyone is waiting, you realise, waiting for evening, waiting for autumn, waiting for relief that feels impossibly far away. Your destination is the public well at the corner of 2 busy streets. This is where your neighbourhood gets its water, has gotten its water for years, probably decades. Generations of people have lowered buckets into that dark shaft and pulled up what they assumed was life itself. Clear and cold and essential. But as you approach, you notice something that makes your stomach tighten with unease. There's a smell. It's faint at first, easy to dismiss as imagination or perhaps some nearby garbage. But as you get closer, it becomes undeniable. The well smells wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not the overwhelming stench of obvious rot. But a subtle wrongness that some primitive part of your brain recognizes as danger. It's the smell of water that has been still too long. Of organic matter breaking down somewhere in the depths, of something that was once alive and is now very much not. You peer over the edge of the well and see nothing but darkness. The water level is lower than you remember, the summer has been dry as well as hot, and the water table has dropped. What water remains has been sitting there, warming slightly despite the depth, becoming a perfect breeding ground for things you cannot see and would not understand even if you could. Here's a historical fact that would horrify you if you knew it. The science of germs, of bacteria, of microscopic organisms that cause disease. None of this exists yet in any meaningful way. Oh, there are theories, there are suspicions. Some physicians have begun to notice patterns, to wonder if perhaps disease spreads through something other than bad air and divine punishment. But the germ theory of disease won't be firmly established for another 20 years or more. Right now, in this sweltering summer, most educated people believe that sickness comes from miasma, from foul-smelling air, from the poisonous vapours that rise from swamps and garbage heaps and, yes, from bad-smelling water. And here's the darkly funny thing about the miasma theory. It was wrong about the mechanism, but often right about the outcome. Water that smelled bad was frequently dangerous, not because the smell itself caused illness, but because the smell indicated contamination that could kill you. So your instinct to be suspicious of this well, your reluctance to drink what it offers, that instinct might save your life, even if neither you nor anyone else fully understands why. You step back from the well and consider your options. You could drink the water anyway. Many people do. Many people have no choice. Water is water, and thirst is thirst. And when you're poor and the summer is brutal, you drink what's available and hope for the best. Some of those people will be fine. The human body is remarkably resilient, and not every sip of questionable water leads to disaster. But some of those people will not be fine. Some will develop cramping and fever within days. Some will be dead within a week, their bodies unable to fight off the invisible armies that invaded through that innocent-looking cup of well water. Historians still argue whether urban Americans of this era understood just how dangerous their water supplies were. Some evidence suggests a kind of willful ignorance. People knew the water smelled bad, knew that summer brought sickness, but couldn't quite bring themselves to believe that something so essential, so fundamental to life, could be killing them. Other evidence suggests that people knew perfectly well and simply had no alternatives. What were they supposed to do? Stop drinking? Move to the countryside? The impossible often becomes acceptable when the alternative is immediate thirst. You decide to walk on to find something else to drink. But what? The question that would seem absurd to anyone from the 21st century, what will you drink if not water, was a genuine daily puzzle for millions of Americans throughout the 19th century. The answers they found were creative, sometimes desperate, occasionally bizarre, and often surprisingly effective, even if no one quite understood why. As you wander away from the suspect well, you pass a tavern. Through the open door, you can see men sitting at rough wooden tables, tankards in front of them, finding their hydration in something decidedly more interesting than water. And you begin to realise that the story of what people drank when water went bad is not just a story about survival. It's a story about how entire cultures adapted to danger they couldn't see, how communities developed traditions and preferences and even moral judgments around the simple act of quenching thirst. The tavern calls to you. The smell of hops and fermentation drifts out into the street, mixing with the summer heat. You know that what they're serving in there isn't exactly health food by any modern standard. But you also know, in some instinctive way that you couldn't articulate, that the beer in that tavern is probably safer than the water in that well. You're about to step inside when a child runs past you, maybe 8 or 9 years old, carrying a small jug. She's headed somewhere with purpose, and you find yourself curious about where she's going, what she's fetching. Because children drink too, of course. Children get thirsty in the summer heat just like everyone else. And surely, no one is giving beer to children. Actually, you're about to discover that the answer to that question is far more complicated than you might expect. The sun continues its slow arc across the hazy sky. The heat shows no signs of relenting, and somewhere in this city, and in cities and towns and farms all across America, millions of people are making the same calculations you're making right now. What can I drink that won't kill me? The answers they're finding would surprise you. Some would alarm you. A few might even make you laugh. Welcome to summer in 19th century America. Leave your assumptions about water at the door, and whatever you do, don't drink from that well. The child with the jug has disappeared around a corner, but her image stays with you as you stand in the summer heat, still thinking about that smell rising from the well. What is it exactly that makes water go bad? And why does summer seem to bring so much more sickness than winter? These questions hover at the edge of your consciousness, unanswerable with the knowledge available in this decade, but impossible to ignore when the evidence of danger is quite literally under your nose. You decide to follow the shaded side of the street, moving slowly to conserve energy, and as you walk, you let your mind drift into the invisible world that you cannot see, but that is, at this very moment, determining whether you live or die. The water in that well, if you could somehow shrink yourself down to microscopic size and swim through it, would reveal horrors. Bacteria drift through the murky depths in concentrations that would make a modern public health official weep. Some of these bacteria are relatively harmless, the normal flora of any natural water source, organisms that have coexisted with humans for millennia without causing significant problems. But others are killers, and summer is their season. Vibrio cholerae, the bacterium that causes cholera, thrives in warm water. During the winter months it lies dormant or exists in such small numbers that it poses little threat. But as temperatures rise, as the water table drops, as wells and cisterns and rivers warm under the relentless sun, cholera bacteria multiply with terrifying speed. A water source that was safe in April can become a death sentence by July. And the cruelest irony is that cholera makes you desperately thirsty even as it drains the water from your body, trapping victims in a cycle where the very thing they crave most is the thing that's killing them. Then there's typhoid fever, caused by Salmonella typhi, another bacterium that loves warm, contaminated water. Typhoid is slower than cholera, more insidious. It takes a week or two to show symptoms, which means by the time you realise you're sick, you've long forgotten which specific drink or meal might have been the culprit. The fever climbs steadily, day after day, until you're delirious and weak and covered in a distinctive rash. Some people survive typhoid, many don't, and those who do often carry the bacteria for years afterward, spreading it to others through food they prepare or water they contaminate, never knowing they've become unwitting agents of death. You pass a pump now, one of the newer ones installed on a street corner, meant to provide clean water to the neighbourhood. A woman is working the handle, filling a bucket. The water that emerges looks clear enough. It doesn't smell, at least not from where you're standing. But you've already learned not to trust appearances. That pump draws from the same water table as everything else in this city, and the water table is connected to cellars and cesspools and graveyards and all the other underground repositories of human waste and human remains that nobody really wants to think about. Here's a quirky historical detail that illustrates just how confused people were about water contamination in this era. There was widespread belief that running water was always safer than still water. This wasn't entirely wrong. Water that moves does tend to be healthier than water that stagnates, but people applied this principle in ways that made no sense at all. Some families would stir their well water vigorously before drinking it, believing that the motion would somehow purify it. Others would let water sit in open containers, thinking that exposure to air would sweeten it. Neither practice did anything to address the actual problem, but both made people feel like they were taking control of their health. The truth is that the danger was invisible, and invisible dangers are almost impossible for humans to take seriously. You can understand why people avoided visibly dirty water that was brown or green or had things floating in it. That kind of contamination triggered instinctive disgust, the same disgust you felt at the smell of that well earlier. But crystal clear water that happened to contain typhoid bacteria? Your ancestors had no way to detect that threat. They drank it confidently, wondering why God had chosen to afflict them with fever a week later. Historians still argue whether there was any genuine understanding of waterborne disease before the famous John Snow cholera investigation of 1854. Some scholars point to earlier observations, physicians who noticed that certain wells seemed to produce more sickness than others, public health officials who recommended boiling water without quite knowing why it helped. But these insights were scattered and inconsistent, drowned out by louder voices insisting that disease came from bad air, from moral failings, from the wrath of an angry deity. You find a spot of deep shade beneath an awning and stop to rest for a moment. The heat is making you slightly dizzy, and you realise you haven't had anything to drink in hours. This is dangerous. The human body needs water constantly, especially in summer, and you're already behind on your intake. Your mouth is dry, your lips are starting to crack, and there's a headache building behind your eyes that signals the early stages of dehydration. But every source of water you've passed has seemed questionable. The well with the smell, the pump that might or might not be drawing from contaminated groundwater, the horse trough that you wouldn't consider even in your most desperate moment. The river, visible at the end of the street, which you know from observation is essentially an open sewer that happens to flow. This is the dilemma that faced millions of Americans every summer throughout the 1800s. Drink and risk disease. Don't drink and risk dehydration. Choose wrong and die either way. It's a choice that seems almost absurdly primitive from a modern perspective, but for the people living through it, there was nothing absurd about it at all. It was simply life, with all its brutal trade-offs. The summer of 1832 brought cholera to America for the first time in a major way, sweeping through cities like New York and Philadelphia, and leaving thousands dead. The summer of 1849 brought it back even worse. The summer of 1866 would bring another devastating wave. Between these major outbreaks, smaller clusters of disease appeared every warm season, typhoid and dysentery and various summer complaints that doctors couldn't quite diagnose, but that everyone knew were connected somehow to the heat and the water and the mysterious processes of putrefaction that seemed to accelerate when the temperature climbed. A dog trots past you, panting heavily, and you watch it approach a puddle in the gutter. The dog drinks without hesitation, its tongue lapping up water that looks absolutely disgusting, grey-brown and flecked with debris. You wonder if the dog will get sick. Probably not, you realise. Animals seem to have stronger stomachs than humans, or perhaps they're simply better adapted to their environment. But watching the dog drink makes your own thirst worse, and you know you need to find something soon. What you need, you're beginning to understand, is an alternative to water. Something that will hydrate you without killing you. Something that humans have figured out how to make safe, even if they don't understand the science behind their success. And that's when you remember the tavern you passed a few blocks back. The smell of hops and fermentation. The men with tankards of beer, looking significantly more relaxed than anyone trying to survive on water alone. You understand now why alcohol has been humanity's companion for so many thousands of years. It's not just about getting drunk, though that's certainly part of the appeal. It's about survival. It's about finding something to drink when drinking water means gambling with your life. The fermentation process that creates alcohol also creates an environment hostile to most dangerous bacteria. The alcohol itself has some antiseptic properties. The boiling that's often part of brewing kills organisms that would otherwise thrive, and the acidity of many fermented beverages adds another layer of protection. None of the people drinking beer in that tavern know any of this, of course. They just know that beer doesn't make you sick the way water sometimes does. They've learnt this through generations of trial and error, through watching neighbours die after drinking from bad wells while the regular patrons of the local tavern somehow stayed healthy. You push yourself up from your shady spot and begin walking back toward the tavern. Your thirst has become urgent now, a physical demand that overrides your preference for exploring the city. You need to drink something, and beer is starting to sound like not just an indulgence but a medical necessity. The summer sun continues to beat down. The smell of the city, horses and garbage and humanity packed too closely together, rises around you. And somewhere in the invisible world of bacteria and contamination, the tiny organisms that want to kill you continue their patient multiplication, waiting for you to make a mistake. You're not going to make that mistake, at least not today. Today, you're going to the tavern. The tavern door creaks as you push it open, and you're immediately hit by a wall of sensory information that feels almost overwhelming after the bright, brutal clarity of the street outside. The light is dim here, filtering through small windows and the open doorway behind you. The air is thick with the smell of spilled beer, sawdust on the floor, tobacco smoke curling up toward the low ceiling, and underneath it all, the yeasty, slightly sour scent of fermentation that seems to seep from the very walls. Men sit at rough wooden tables, most of them alone or in pairs, nursing drinks that range from pale amber to deep brown. Nobody's talking much. It's too hot for conversation. They're here for the same reason you are. To escape the heat, to find something safe to drink, to pass the most miserable hours of the day in relative comfort. A few glance up when you enter, then look away, uninterested in a stranger's business. You make your way to the bar, where a man with impressive forearms and a stained apron is wiping glasses with a rag that doesn't look particularly clean. But you're not here to judge the sanitation standards. You're here to drink something that won't kill you, and this man is your best hope. Beer, you say, and he nods without comment, reaching for one of several taps behind him. What he pours you is not what a modern person would recognise as beer. It's cloudy for one thing, with visible particles floating in it. The colour is somewhere between yellow and brown, not quite either. The foam on top is thin and disappears quickly, and when you take your first sip you discover a flavour profile that's simultaneously familiar and strange. Definitely beer, definitely fermented grain, but with undertones of sourness and earthiness that suggest this beverage has never met a quality control inspector. But here's the thing, it's cold. Well, coolish. Cool enough to feel like relief against your parched throat, and more importantly, it's safe. You don't know the science, but you can feel it somehow. This drink won't betray you the way that well water might have. The history of beer as a water substitute stretches back thousands of years, long before the Americas were even known to Europeans. In medieval Europe, beer and wine were daily necessities, not luxuries, precisely because water was so often dangerous. Monasteries brewed beer as a public service, providing safe hydration to communities that might otherwise have perished from waterborne disease. When European colonists came to America, they brought their brewing traditions with them, and for good reason. The Pilgrims, those famous early arrivals, were famously beer-dependent. One reason they landed at Plymouth Rock instead of continuing south to their intended destination was that they were running low on beer and couldn't risk a longer voyage without something safe to drink. This wasn't alcoholism or lack of self-control. It was survival strategy. They knew that water on a ship goes bad quickly, that the barrels foul and the contents become deadly, while beer stays drinkable for weeks or months. Here's a quirky detail that might surprise you. The beer most commonly consumed in early America wasn't the strong stuff you might imagine. It was something called small beer or ship's beer, with an alcohol content so low that you could drink it all day without getting significantly impaired. We're talking maybe 2 or 3% alcohol, sometimes less, roughly the strength of a modern light beer, or even weaker. This wasn't drinking for pleasure or intoxication, this was drinking for basic hydration, and everyone drank it. That's the part that seems strangest from a modern perspective, where we carefully separate adult beverages from children's beverages and would be horrified at the thought of giving beer to a 6-year-old. In the 1800s, small beer was family fare. Children drank it with breakfast, pregnant women drank it throughout the day, nursing mothers believed it helped their milk come in. The idea that alcohol should be reserved for adults was simply not part of the cultural framework. You take another long sip of your beer and feel some of the tension leaving your shoulders. The headache behind your eyes is starting to fade. Your body is getting what it needs. Fluid, electrolytes from the fermented grain, even some calories and B vitamins as a bonus. You're not just avoiding poison, you're actually nourishing yourself. The man next to you at the bar catches your eye and nods in that minimal way that passes for friendliness among strangers. He's drinking something darker than your beer, something that might be a porter or a stout. And he looks like a man who's been drinking it for decades. His face has that particular weathered quality of someone who spends his days outdoors, and his evenings in places like this. "Hot one?" he says, which passes for conversation. "Sure is," you reply. He grunts and returns to his drink. Social obligations have been fulfilled. The tavern is filling up now as the afternoon wears on and more people seek refuge from the heat. A few women have entered, which tells you this is a respectable establishment, at least by the standards of the era. In rougher taverns, women who weren't sex workers rarely ventured inside. But this place has something approaching a family atmosphere. If your family happened to be day drinking to avoid cholera, which in this era they very well might be. Historians still argue whether Americans of the 1800s drank more alcohol than their modern counterparts. The statistics are surprisingly hard to pin down, partly because so much brewing and distilling happened at home without any official record, and partly because definitions of a drink have changed over time. But most scholars agree that alcohol consumption was dramatically higher in the early 19th century than it is today, peaking sometime around the 1820s or 1830s, before temperance movements began pushing back. What's interesting is how unselfconsciously people drank. There was no concept of alcoholism as a disease. That idea was only beginning to emerge, championed by a few reform-minded doctors who noticed that some people seemed unable to stop drinking once they started. For most Americans, alcohol was simply part of daily life, as unremarkable as bread or sleep. Workers took breaks to drink. Farmers paused in their fields to refresh themselves. Even church events sometimes featured alcohol, though this would become increasingly controversial as the century progressed. You signal the bartender for another beer, and as he pours it, you think about what this scene would look like to someone from your own time. The dim light, the tobacco smoke, the men and women drinking in the middle of the afternoon, it would seem dissolute, irresponsible, maybe even dangerous. Don't these people have jobs? Don't they have responsibilities? Why are they sitting around getting drunk when there's work to be done? But the answer, you now understand, is that they're not getting drunk, or at least not very drunk. The beer is too weak for that, and they're drinking too slowly. What they're doing is staying alive. They're making the rational calculation that weak alcohol is safer than strong water, that the slight impairment of low-proof beer is preferable to the complete incapacitation of typhoid fever. They're using the tools available to them to navigate a world full of invisible dangers. The light through the tavern windows has shifted as the sun moves lower in the sky. The worst heat of the day is passing, though the evening will still be uncomfortably warm. You've had 2 beers now, and you feel almost normal, not intoxicated, but also not desperately thirsty anymore. Your body has the fluid it needs, the immediate crisis has passed, but you're also aware that this is only a temporary solution. Beer costs money, and not everyone has money. Beer requires infrastructure, breweries, taverns, distribution networks, and not everyone has access to that infrastructure. What do poor people drink when they can't afford beer? What do farmers drink when they're miles from the nearest tavern? What do children drink when their parents are too religious or too reform-minded to allow alcohol in the house? The answers to these questions you're about to discover are just as creative and just as desperate as the beer-drinking culture you've just experienced. The 1800s was an era of experimentation, of improvisation, of finding whatever worked in an environment where official guidance was scarce and scientific understanding was nearly non-existent. And then you finish your second beer and leave some coins on the bar. The tavern has served its purpose. You're hydrated, you're safe, and you've learned something important about survival in this era. But the story isn't over. There are other beverages to explore, other strategies to discover, other ways that Americans found to quench their thirst without dying in the process. You push back out into the late afternoon sun, still hot but no longer quite so punishing. The street is busier now, people emerging from their hiding places as the temperature drops, and somewhere out there, in kitchens and farms and improvised drink stands, other solutions are being poured and served and consumed by people just as thirsty as you. You've barely walked a block from the tavern when you see her again. The child with the jug, the one who ran past you earlier with such obvious purpose. She's coming back now, and the jug is clearly heavier than before, full of whatever she was sent to fetch. She walks carefully, both hands wrapped around the ceramic container, concentrating on not spilling a single precious drop. Your curiosity gets the better of you. You find yourself following at a discreet distance, not wanting to alarm a child with the attention of a stranger, but genuinely wondering what she's carrying. Is it water? Milk? Something else entirely? The jug offers no clues. It's the same kind of vessel that might hold any number of liquids. She turns down a side street, then into an even narrower alley, and finally disappears through a door that leads to what looks like a modest family home. You can't follow her inside without being genuinely creepy, so you stop at the corner and observe. Through a window that's open to catch any possible breeze, you can hear voices, a mother's voice, children's voices, the general clatter of a household preparing for the evening meal, and then you catch a whiff of something that answers your question. It's the smell of fermentation, but different from the beer you just drank. Sweeter, lighter, more like fruit than grain. The child was fetching cider, or more precisely she was fetching small cider, the low-alcohol version of apple cider that served the same function in many American households as small beer, and suddenly you understand something important about how families in this era kept their children alive through dangerous summers. Here's a historical fact that tends to shock modern parents. Giving alcohol to children was not just common in 1840s America, it was practically universal. The question wasn't whether children would drink alcohol, but what kind of alcohol they would drink and how much. Small beer and small cider, with their minimal alcohol content, were considered as appropriate for children as milk or water would be today. More appropriate, actually, since they were safer. The logic, when you think about it, makes a certain kind of sense. If water can kill you, and if fermented beverages are demonstrably safer than water, then of course you give fermented beverages to your children. You're not trying to get them drunk, you're trying to keep them from dying of cholera. The alcohol content is so low that it poses little risk of intoxication. A child drinking small beer all day might consume the equivalent of one modern beer's worth of alcohol, spread out over 12 or 14 hours. That's not going to impair anyone, but it might save their life. What's fascinating is how thoroughly this practice has been forgotten. Modern Americans tend to assume that the past was more moralistic and restrictive than the present, especially when it comes to children. But in this particular area, the opposite is true. Our ancestors were far more relaxed about children and alcohol than we are, not because they didn't care about child welfare, but because they defined child welfare differently. Keeping a child alive through summer was the primary goal. If that required giving them beverages that happened to contain small amounts of alcohol, then so be it. You linger near the alley for a moment longer, listening to the sounds of family life drifting through the open window. A mother is dividing the cider among several children. You can tell from the conversation. There's some squabbling over who gets the largest share, children being children regardless of the century. Someone is complaining that the cider is too warm, and the mother's voice responds with the weary patience of parents everywhere. Then you'll drink it warm, won't you? Cider occupied a special place in American culture throughout the 1700s and into the 1800s. Before beer became widely available, before tea and coffee became affordable luxuries, Cider was the default beverage of rural America. Farmers planted apple orchards not primarily for eating apples. Many of the apple varieties grown were too bitter or sour for pleasant eating, but for cider production. A family with a productive orchard and the equipment to press cider could keep themselves supplied with safe hydration year-round. The process was straightforward. You harvested your apples in the fall, pressed them to extract the juice, and then let that juice ferment naturally. The wild yeast present on the apple skins did the work, converting the sugar in the juice into alcohol. The result was hard cider, which could be quite strong, but you could also stop the fermentation early or dilute the finished product to create something gentler, something suitable for children and pregnant women and anyone who needed to stay relatively clear-headed. Here's a quirky detail that illustrates just how central cider was to American life. The legendary Johnny Appleseed, whose real name was John Chapman, was not planting apple trees so that frontier families could enjoy fresh fruit. He was planting the raw material for cider production. The apples that grew from his seeds were almost all too sour and bitter to eat out of hand. They were cider apples, intended for pressing and fermenting, and Chapman was essentially bringing the gift of safe hydration to communities on the edge of American settlement. Historians still argue whether Chapman understood the public health implications of his work, or whether he was simply motivated by religious conviction and a general love of apple trees. Some scholars see him as a deliberate benefactor, spreading the means of survival to families who would otherwise have been dependent on dangerous water sources. Others see him as more of an eccentric wanderer who happened to do something useful. Either way, his legacy shaped drinking habits across the American frontier. You move away from the alley, having gathered what intelligence you can about family drinking practices. The sun is getting lower now, casting long shadows across the street, and the temperature has dropped from brutal to merely uncomfortable. You're still processing what you've learned, that children in this era grew up drinking weak alcohol, that this was considered not just acceptable but responsible parenting. It challenges something in your modern assumptions, doesn't it? We tend to think of progress as moving in a straight line toward more enlightenment, more protection, more careful stewardship of childhood. But the reality is more complicated. The parents of the 1840s weren't negligent or ignorant for giving their children cider and small beer. They were making the best choices available to them, using the knowledge they had in an environment far more dangerous than anything most modern parents will ever face. You pass a cart selling something that might be lemonade, though the colour is suspicious, and the vendor's hygiene leaves something to be desired. You decide not to risk it. The beer is still settling comfortably in your stomach, and you're not ready to gamble your intestinal health on street vendor beverages of uncertain provenance. But the cart makes you think about the other options available to people who, for whatever reason, couldn't or wouldn't drink alcohol. Temperance movements were beginning to gain strength in this era. Religious groups who preached that all alcohol was sinful and that water, despite its dangers, was the only moral choice for hydration. What did those families drink? How did they keep their children alive through summers when the wells went bad? The answers, you're beginning to realise, form a patchwork of improvisation and tradition, of folk remedies and scientific accidents, of desperate experiments and happy discoveries. The story of what people drank when water went bad is not a single story, but a collection of stories, each family and community finding its own solutions to the universal problem of thirst. A church bell sounds in the distance, marking the hour. The day is winding toward evening, and somewhere in this city, in homes and taverns and makeshift drink stands, people are pouring and sipping and swallowing, hydrating themselves with whatever they've decided is safe enough to trust. Tomorrow will bring more heat, more thirst, more calculations about risk and necessity, but for now you've made it through another summer day without drinking the wrong thing. That's a victory, even if it doesn't feel like one. You wake the next morning to the sound of a rooster that has no business being in an urban neighbourhood, but seems to have taken up residence somewhere nearby regardless. The heat has already begun to build, promising another brutal day, and your first thought is of thirst. Your mouth is dry from sleep, your body demanding immediate hydration before you've even fully opened your eyes. But today, instead of navigating the questionable water sources of the city, you're going to take a trip. You've heard about the apple country to the north and west, the rolling hills and orchards where families have built entire economies around the production of cider. You want to see it for yourself, to understand how the beverage that was keeping that family alive last night actually comes into being. The journey takes most of the morning, first by cart and then on foot along roads, that become increasingly rural as the city fades behind you. The landscape transforms gradually, brick and cobblestone giving way to dirt paths, dense buildings yielding to scattered farmhouses, the smell of urban compression replaced by the greener scent of growing things. By midday, you're walking between orchards that stretch as far as you can see, apple trees in neat rows, their branches heavy with fruit that won't be fully ripe for another month or two, but is already sizing up promisingly. This is the raw material of American survival, you realise. These trees, planted by generations of farmers who understood that apples meant cider and cider meant safety, represent one of the most successful public health interventions in history, even if nobody thought of it in those terms. You approach a farmhouse where smoke is rising from a chimney, someone's home, someone's place of work. The farmer who emerges to greet you is a man in his 50s, weathered by sun and labour but clearly prosperous by the standards of rural America. His name is something German, something you can't quite catch, and he speaks with an accent that suggests he or his parents came from the old country, bringing their knowledge of fruit cultivation with them. He's happy to show you his operation. Farmers in this era were generally proud of their work and eager to explain it to anyone who showed interest. You walk among his trees as he describes the varieties he grows, some with names you recognise, others with names that have been forgotten by the modern world. Most of them, he explains, are cider apples, not good for eating, too sour, too bitter, too tannic, but perfect for pressing into juice that will ferment into something wonderful. Here's a historical fact that captures the scale of American cider production in this era. By some estimates, the average American adult in the early 1800s consumed several hundred gallons of cider per year. That number seems almost impossible until you remember that cider was replacing water, not supplementing it. If you drink cider instead of water for most of your daily hydration, and if you live in a climate where summer heat drives that hydration need even higher, then several hundred gallons starts to seem almost conservative. The farmer leads you to his cider barn, a structure built specifically for the production and storage of the family beverage. Inside, you see the equipment, a massive wooden press, various barrels and containers, the accumulated technology of centuries of fermentation knowledge. Everything smells faintly of apples, even though the last pressing was months ago. The scent has soaked into the wood itself, becoming part of the building's identity. He explains the process as you examine the equipment. In the fall, when the apples are ripe, the entire family participates in the harvest. The apples are gathered and sorted, the best ones set aside for eating or selling, the majority destined for the press. The pressing itself is hard work, requiring strength and stamina, but the reward is immediate: fresh apple juice that will begin fermenting almost as soon as it hits the barrel. Here's a quirky detail about cider fermentation that would have surprised the farmer if you'd explained it. The yeasts that transform apple juice into alcohol are not something he adds deliberately. They're wild yeasts, present on the skins of the apples themselves, transferred from the fruit to the juice during pressing. Every orchard, every farm, every region develops its own population of wild yeasts, which is why cider from one area tastes different from cider from another. The farmer knows this as a fact of experience. His cider tastes like his cider, but he has no concept of the microbiology involved. The fermentation happens in barrels that line one wall of the barn, some made of oak, others of chestnut or hickory. Different woods impart different flavours, the farmer explains, and he's experimented over the years to find the combinations he likes best. The barrels are reused year after year, which means they also harbour populations of yeast and bacteria that contribute to the fermentation process. A barrel that's been used for cider production for decades has become its own miniature ecosystem. You ask about small cider, the low-alcohol version that families give to children. The farmer nods knowingly. That's made by diluting the regular cider with water, he explains, or by pressing the apple pomace, the leftover pulp from the first pressing, with water to extract the remaining juice. The result is weaker, less flavourful, but still fermented enough to be safe. He gives his own children small cider throughout the summer, he adds, and they've never had the summer sickness that sweeps through families dependent on wells. Historians still argue whether American farmers of this era understood the connection between fermented beverages and disease prevention. Some clearly did, at least intuitively. They could see that their cider-drinking children stayed healthier than the water-drinking children of their neighbours. But the mechanism remained mysterious. Was it something in the apples? Something in the fermentation, something to do with the barrels. Without the concept of germs, without the understanding of bacterial contamination, they could only observe outcomes without grasping causes. The farmer offers you a sample from one of his barrels, and you accept gratefully. The cider is cool, the barn is built partially underground to take advantage of natural refrigeration, and the flavour is unlike anything you've tasted. Sharp and sweet and sour all at once, with a complexity that reflects the dozens of apple varieties that went into its making. You understand immediately why Americans of this era were willing to organise their entire agricultural system around the production of this beverage. As you drink, the farmer tells you about his plans for the coming harvest. He's expecting a good year. The spring was wet enough, the summer dry enough, the conditions about as favourable as a farmer can hope for. He'll press enough cider to supply his own family and have plenty left over to sell to neighbours and to buyers who will transport it to the cities. His cider will end up in taverns and homes all across the region, providing safe hydration to people he'll never meet. You finish your sample and thank the farmer for his time. The afternoon sun is high now, and you should begin the journey back to the city before dark. But as you walk away from the orchard, you carry with you a new appreciation for the apple trees lining the road. Each one is a tiny factory producing the raw materials of survival, a contribution to public health that nobody planned but everybody benefits from. The German and Dutch and English farmers who planted these orchards in the 1700s and 1800s were not thinking about germ theory or waterborne disease. They were thinking about having something good to drink. But their practical wisdom, passed down through generations, accumulated into a system that kept millions of Americans alive through dangerous summers. The apple trees they planted were monuments to human ingenuity, even if nobody thought to carve any inscriptions. You reach the main road and begin the long walk back toward the city. The heat is still formidable, but you're well hydrated from the farmer's cider, and you find yourself thinking about the many other beverages that Americans have devised to survive the summer months. Cider is just one solution among many. There are stranger drinks waiting to be discovered. The road back to the city takes you through farmland of a different sort. Fields of grain and vegetables rather than orchards. Workers are scattered across the landscape, bent over crops or wielding tools under the punishing afternoon sun. And as you watch them work, you notice something interesting. They're drinking. Constantly. Almost compulsively. Jugs and bottles pass from hand to hand, everyone taking swigs of something that clearly isn't water. You approach a group that's taking a brief rest in the shade of a large tree, and you ask them what they're drinking. One of them, a young man with arms already bronzed by weeks of summer labour, offers you his jug with a friendly grin. "Switchel," he says. "Best thing for this work." You take a cautious sip and nearly spit it out. The flavour is intense. There's sweetness, yes, but also a sharp acidity that hits your tongue like a surprise punch. Underneath that, something earthy and complex that takes you a moment to identify. Ginger and vinegar. Lots of vinegar. The workers laugh at your expression. First-timers always react that way, one of them explains, but give it a chance. By the end of a day's work under this sun, you'll be craving the stuff. It replaces something that the heat takes out of you, something that plain water can't restore. What you're experiencing is one of the great forgotten beverages of American history. Switchel, also known as haymaker's punch or swizzle, or about a dozen other regional names, was the energy drink of the 19th century, a mixture of water, vinegar, some kind of sweetener, and usually ginger or other spices. It sounds disgusting to modern sensibilities. It probably sounds disgusting to you right now, your mouth still puckering from that first sip. But generations of American workers swore by its power to sustain them through the brutal labour of summer farming. Here's the historical fact that makes switchel interesting from a health perspective. It actually worked. Not perfectly, not magically, but demonstrably better than plain water for keeping field workers functioning under extreme heat. The vinegar provided acidity that helped with digestion and may have had mild antimicrobial properties. The sweetener, usually molasses or maple syrup or honey, provided quick energy in the form of sugar. The ginger settled stomachs upset by heat and exertion. And the combination of ingredients created an electrolyte balance, roughly similar to what modern sports drinks try to achieve. The workers in the shade are explaining their recipe to you now, each one insisting that his family's version is the best. One swears by molasses as the sweetener, claiming it gives the drink a richness that nothing else can match. Another prefers maple syrup. arguing that molasses is too heavy for hot weather. A third suggests honey, which he believes has medicinal properties beyond mere sweetness. They debate with the passion of people who have strong opinions about something that genuinely matters to their daily comfort. The vinegar, everyone agrees, must be apple cider vinegar. Other vinegars won't do. There's something about the apple that makes the combination work, something that balances the sharpness and adds complexity to the flavour. You remember the farmer you visited earlier with his barrels of cider, and you realise that apple cider vinegar is just cider that's been allowed to ferment past alcohol into acidity. The orchard provides not just one safe beverage, but two. Here's a quirky detail about switchel that the workers probably don't know. The drink has ancient roots extending far beyond America. Similar vinegar-based beverages were consumed in ancient Greece and Rome, in medieval Europe, in various Asian cultures. The combination of sour, sweet and spice seems to be something humans have independently discovered again and again across different times and places. American switchel is just the local version of a nearly universal human innovation. You take another sip from the jug now that you know what to expect. The flavour is still startling, but you can appreciate it more on the second try. There's a cooling effect that seems almost paradoxical. You're drinking something that's room temperature, maybe even a bit warm from sitting in the sun, but it makes you feel cooler somehow. The ginger creates a tingling sensation that distracts from the heat. The sourness makes you salivate, which helps with the dry mouth that comes from working in the sun. One of the workers tells you about his grandmother, who always made switchel for the family during haying season. She had her own secret additions, a bit of oatmeal stirred in for body, some herbs from her garden that she wouldn't name. The drink she produced was so good that neighbours would find excuses to visit during haying season just to get a taste. That grandmother is gone now, and her recipe died with her, but the worker still tries to recreate it from memory every summer. Historians still argue whether switchel's popularity was due to genuine efficacy or simply tradition and availability. Some scholars point to the documented benefits of the ingredients, the electrolytes, the carbohydrates, the antimicrobial properties, and suggest that workers stuck with switchel because it measurably helped them work longer and feel better. Others argue that the drink was popular mainly because it was cheap and easy to make, using ingredients that most farm families already had on hand, and that any hydration would have done equally well. The truth, as with many historical questions, is probably somewhere in between. Switchel was popular because it worked well enough, because it was affordable, and because it had become part of the culture of farming communities. When you're working alongside a dozen other labourers, all of them drinking switchel, you drink switchel too. When your grandmother made it, and your mother made it, and everyone you know makes it, you make it without questioning whether something else might be better. You hand the jug back to its owner and thank the workers for sharing their break with you. They wave you off with the casual friendliness of people who have more work to do, but appreciate a moment of distraction. As you walk on, you think about the inventiveness of people facing problems without modern solutions. Nobody told them to mix vinegar and ginger and sweetener. They figured it out through experimentation, through observation, through the accumulated wisdom of communities that had to solve the problem of summer hydration, or watch their members collapse in the fields. A related beverage floats into your consciousness. The shrub. You've heard of it, but haven't encountered it yet on this journey. Shrubs were similar to switchel, but made with fruit, usually berries, macerated in vinegar, and sweetened to create a concentrated syrup that could be diluted with water. They were especially popular in the American South, where summer heat lasted longer, and the need for refreshing beverages was even more acute. The fruit added vitamins and flavour while the vinegar did its antimicrobial work. Like switchel, shrubs sound strange to modern ears, but were beloved by the people who drank them. A well-made shrub, diluted with cool water on a hot afternoon, was one of the great simple pleasures available to Americans of limited means. You're getting thirsty again, you realise. The switchel sample wasn't enough to fully hydrate you, and the walk is demanding in this heat, but you're also getting closer to the city, where other options await. The diverse landscape of 19th century beverages is becoming clearer in your mind. A patchwork of solutions, each with its own logic, each meeting the same fundamental need for safe hydration in a world where water couldn't be trusted. The sun continues its slow descent toward the western horizon. Another summer day is passing, another day of people figuring out what to drink in order to survive. And somewhere ahead, in kitchens and pharmacies and improvised drink stands, more discoveries are waiting. You return to the city as the afternoon shadows lengthen, your mind full of orchards and switchel and the accumulated wisdom of farming communities. But the urban landscape presents its own set of drinking challenges, and as you navigate the crowded streets you notice something you hadn't paid attention to before: the lemonade sellers. They're everywhere once you start looking. Small stands set up on corners, carts wheeled into position near busy intersections, entrepreneurs of various ages and backgrounds hawking their wares to thirsty passers-by. Lemonade! Cold lemonade! Penny a glass! The cries blend into the general noise of the city, but they represent something important, another solution to the problem of safe hydration, this one relying not on fermentation but on acidity. You approach one of the stands, run by a woman who has clearly been doing this for years. Her setup is efficient and well organised. A large container of lemonade, a stack of glasses that she rinses between customers, a small cash box for coins. She pours you a glass without waiting for you to ask, confident that anyone who approaches her stand is there for one reason only. The lemonade is not quite what you expected. It's sweet, yes, and sour, definitely. But there's a harshness to the acidity that suggests the lemons were not of the highest quality, and a graininess to the sweetness that tells you the sugar wasn't fully dissolved. Still, it's cold, genuinely cold, which means she must have access to ice, a luxury that not every lemonade seller can claim, and it's wet, which is really all you care about at this point. Here's a historical fact about lemonade that might surprise you. It was actually quite controversial in the 19th century. Not morally controversial, like alcohol, but medically controversial. Physicians disagreed vehemently about whether acidic drinks were healthy or harmful. Some argued that the citric acid in lemons was a powerful preventative against disease, killing the invisible agents of sickness before they could take hold in your body. Others insisted that acidic drinks irritated the stomach and weakened the constitution, making you more susceptible to summer illnesses. The debate was particularly heated because nobody could point to definitive evidence either way. Unlike fermentation, which had centuries of apparent success in preventing waterborne disease, citrus drinks were relatively new to the American experience. Lemons didn't grow in most of the United States and had to be imported, usually from the Mediterranean or the Caribbean, which made them expensive and limited their availability. Lemonade was a luxury drink that only became accessible to ordinary Americans in the early 19th century, as trade networks improved and prices dropped. The woman running the lemonade stand has opinions about the medical controversy, which she shares without prompting. She's seen plenty of doctors, she tells you, and they can't agree on anything. One says drink lemonade, another says avoid it, a third says drink it only in the mornings. She's concluded that the doctors don't know what they're talking about, and that her own experience is a better guide. She's been drinking lemonade every summer for 30 years, she says, and she's never had the cholera or the typhoid or any of the other summer complaints. That's proof enough for her. Here's a quirky detail that adds another layer to the lemonade debate. Some people believe that the acidity of lemons could actually neutralize poisons, making contaminated water safe to drink. This theory had enough currency that you might see people squeezing lemon juice into water of questionable origin, confident that the citrus would purify what they were about to consume. There was even a modest scientific basis for this belief. Acids do inhibit bacterial growth under certain conditions, but the effect was nowhere near strong enough to make seriously contaminated water safe. Historians still argue whether lemonade sellers of the 19th century were providing a genuine public health service or simply feeding a taste for novelty. Some scholars point to the antimicrobial properties of citric acid and suggest that lemonade, while not as reliably safe as fermented beverages, was still safer than plain water in many circumstances. Others note that the conditions under which lemonade was prepared and served, the unwashed hands, the reused glasses, the flies buzzing around open containers, probably introduced as many pathogens as the lemon juice eliminated. The truth is that lemonade was a gamble, and the people drinking it were gambling without knowing the odds. Sometimes the gamble paid off, sometimes it didn't. The same could be said of almost every beverage choice in the 19th century, except for the ones, like well-fermented beer or cider, that had enough alcohol to genuinely sterilize their contents. You finish your glass and pay the woman her penny. She thanks you and immediately turns to the next customer, a man who looks even more dehydrated than you were. The lemonade stand is doing good business on this hot afternoon, regardless of what the physicians might say about the wisdom of acidic drinks. As you walk away, you think about the position of the lemonade sellers in the social hierarchy of 19th century beverage providers. They were entrepreneurs in a very literal sense, people who saw a need and tried to fill it, often with minimal capital and considerable risk. A lemonade stand required lemons, sugar, water, ice if possible, and some way to keep the whole operation sanitary enough that customers didn't visibly recoil. It was not an easy business, but it was one that almost anyone could enter with enough determination. The sellers themselves were often women, or children, or members of immigrant communities looking for any foothold in the American economy. Lemonade selling was a respectable way to earn money without factory work or domestic service, and the seasonal nature of the business, demand peaked in summer and collapsed in winter, made it compatible with other obligations. Many sellers were simply helping their families survive until the next opportunity came along. You pass another stand, this one selling what appears to be some kind of fruit punch, lemonade mixed with other juices perhaps, or with the fruit shrubs you learned about earlier. The combinations were limited only by imagination and availability. Some sellers developed secret recipes that became locally famous, drawing customers from across the city. Others stuck with simple lemonade, figuring that a reliable basic product was better than a complicated one that might not appeal to everyone's taste. The sun is setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seem almost too beautiful for this grimy, sweaty city. Another day of summer drinking is coming to an end. Tomorrow will bring more heat, more thirst, more visits to wells and taverns and lemonade stands. The cycle continues day after day, till finally the weather breaks and autumn brings relief. But you're not waiting for autumn. You're exploring the full range of options available to someone navigating the treacherous waters, literally treacherous, of 19th century hydration. And tomorrow, you're going to investigate something that interests you, the role of coffee and tea in this ecosystem of survival beverages. The morning arrives with the smell of coffee drifting through the boarding house where you found lodging. It's a rich, bitter aroma that cuts through the staleness of summer air and the lingering scent of last night's cooking. You follow your nose down to the common room, where the landlady is presiding over a large pot that sits on the stove, steam rising from its surface in lazy curls. Coffee. You've been meaning to pay more attention to this particular beverage, and here it is, ready and waiting. The landlady pours you a cup without asking whether you want one. In this household, apparently, coffee is simply what happens in the morning, as natural as breathing. The cup she hands you is hot. That's the first thing you notice, and it seems almost aggressive in this weather. Who wants a hot drink when the day is already promising to be sweltering? But you wrap your hands around the cup anyway, inhaling the steam, and take your first sip. It's not good coffee by any modern standard. It's bitter and burnt, overcooked on the stove for who knows how long, with a muddy quality that suggests the grounds weren't filtered as thoroughly as they might have been. But it's coffee, unmistakably, and there's something about the ritual of morning coffee that transcends questions of quality. You drink it because it's there, because everyone else is drinking it, because the caffeine is already beginning to lift the fog of sleep from your brain. Here's the historical fact that makes coffee interesting in the context of summer hydration. Boiling water kills bacteria. You know this. The people of the 1840s didn't know it, not in any scientific sense, but they benefited from it nonetheless. Every cup of coffee consumed, every pot of water boiled to brew the bitter beverage, represented water that had been made safe without anyone understanding why. The coffee drinking habit that spread across America in the 19th century was, in a very real sense, a public health intervention disguised as a luxury. People drank coffee because they liked the taste, because they wanted the stimulation of caffeine, because it had become a social ritual that marked the transition from sleep to wakefulness. But they were also, without knowing it, protecting themselves from the invisible pathogens that thrived in unboiled water. The landlady sits down at the table with her own cup and launches into conversation. She's a talker, this one, and you're a captive audience until you finish your coffee and escape. But what she's saying is actually interesting. She's describing her own methods for preparing safe beverages, honed over years of keeping a boarding house where guests expect not to die from what they drink. She always boils her water, she explains. Always. Even in summer, even when the fire makes the kitchen unbearably hot. She learned this from her mother, who learned it from her mother, going back generations to a time when nobody had any idea why it mattered, but everyone knew that it did. Her family had a lower rate of summer illness than their neighbours, and they attributed it to cleanliness, to good morals, to divine favour. But the actual reason, if they'd known it, was simpler. They boiled their water, and boiling killed the things that would otherwise have killed them. Here's a quirky detail that the landlady doesn't mention, but that captures the confused state of medical knowledge in this era. Some physicians actually advised against drinking hot beverages in summer. The logic was that hot drinks would raise the body's internal temperature, making heat exhaustion more likely. Cool drinks were prescribed instead, even if they came from questionable sources. This advice, well-intentioned but catastrophically wrong, may have cost many lives. The people who ignored their doctors and drank hot coffee anyway were the lucky ones. You finish your cup and ask the landlady for another. She obliges cheerfully. Coffee is included in your room rate, apparently, and you settle in for another round of morning ritual. The second cup goes down easier than the first, your tongue having adjusted to the bitterness. You can feel the caffeine working now, your thoughts sharpening, your energy rising despite the heat that's already building outside. Coffee arrived in America relatively late compared to Europe, where coffee houses had been fixtures of urban life since the 17th century. American colonists initially preferred cider and beer and rum, beverages they could produce locally rather than import from distant tropical regions. But coffee became politically significant after the Boston Tea Party, when drinking tea was seen as unpatriotic and coffee emerged as the beverage of American independence. Historians still argue whether this political symbolism genuinely drove coffee adoption, or whether it was primarily economic factors, the increasing availability and decreasing cost of coffee beans that made Americans into coffee drinkers. Probably both factors contributed. By the 1840s, coffee was thoroughly established in American culture, and the morning cup had become a ritual that crossed class boundaries. Rich and poor alike drank coffee, though the quality varied dramatically depending on what you could afford. The landlady is telling you now about the different types of coffee available in the city. There's the cheap stuff, barely deserving the name, made from beans that have been adulterated with everything from chicory to ground acorns. There's the middling stuff, honest coffee but poorly roasted and carelessly prepared. And there's the good stuff, available at finer establishments, roasted with care and brewed with attention. She claims her coffee falls into the middling category, which you suspect is generous, but you don't argue.
Yeah.
What you're really thinking about is the public health angle. Every cup of coffee consumed in this city represents a cup of water that was boiled before drinking. Multiply that by thousands of people, by millions of cups per day, and you have an accidental sterilization program of enormous scale. Coffee didn't prevent all waterborne disease. People still drank unboiled water throughout the day. But it reduced the overall burden of contamination that human bodies had to fight off. You thank the landlady for the coffee and head out into the morning. The day stretches before you, full of heat and thirst and choices about what to drink. But you've started well, with 2 cups of boiled water disguised as bitter stimulant. Your body doesn't know why it's safer, but it is. The coffee culture you've just witnessed will only grow stronger as the century progresses. Americans will become among the world's greatest coffee consumers, developing an almost religious devotion to the morning cup. And all along, without anyone quite realizing it, coffee will be saving lives. Not a bad legacy for a bitter bean from the tropics. The coffee has given you energy, but it's also reminded you of its close cousin in the world of hot beverages, tea. And tea, in this particular moment of American history, occupies a fascinating and somewhat awkward position. You decide to spend part of your day exploring the tea question, and your wanderings eventually lead you to a small shop in a neighbourhood with a distinctly British character. The shop is run by an elderly woman with an accent that marks her as English-born, someone who came to America but never quite let go of the old country's habits. She sells tea, along with the paraphernalia that accompanies it, pots and cups and strainers and cozies, and she receives you with the warmth of someone who doesn't get enough customers. Tea, she explains, is a superior beverage in every way. More refined than coffee, more healthful than spirits, more civilized than the crude concoctions Americans seem to prefer. She pours you a cup from a pot that's been steeping on her counter, and the liquid that emerges is a deep amber colour, rich and aromatic. This is not the pale, weak tea you might have encountered elsewhere. This is proper English tea, brewed strong and served with confidence. Here's the historical fact that makes tea complicated in America. The Boston Tea Party cast a long shadow. More than 60 years have passed since colonists dumped British tea into Boston Harbour, declaring that they would rather drink harbour water than submit to British taxation. The political symbolism of that act lingered long after the taxes were forgotten. Drinking tea, for many Americans, still felt vaguely unpatriotic, like collaborating with the former enemy. This is why coffee became the American drink while tea remained dominant in Britain. The beverages themselves were roughly equivalent in their benefits. Both required boiling water, both offered stimulation without intoxication, both could be enjoyed at any time of day. But the political baggage attached to tea pushed Americans toward coffee as their hot beverage of choice. The shop owner is aware of this dynamic and somewhat bitter about it. She points out correctly that tea is actually a better beverage for hot weather than coffee. The caffeine content is lower, making it less likely to cause jitters and dehydration. The compounds in tea have a gentle astringency that cleanses the palate and makes you feel cooler even as you drink something hot. And the ritual of tea preparation, the warming of the pot, the measuring of the leaves, the patient steeping, is more calming and civilized than the hasty preparation of coffee. You sip your tea and have to admit she has a point. This is a pleasant beverage, more subtle than coffee but no less satisfying in its way. The warmth spreads through your body, and paradoxically, you do feel cooler somehow. Maybe there's something to the British habit of drinking hot tea in hot weather. Here's a quirky detail about tea in America that the shop owner probably doesn't know. Despite the patriotic rejection of tea after the Revolution, Americans never stopped drinking it entirely. Tea consumption dropped dramatically, but it never disappeared. In certain communities, particularly among women, immigrants from tea-drinking cultures, and people in coastal cities with easy access to imported goods, tea remained a daily habit. The political symbolism faded over time, and by the 1840s tea was making something of a comeback. Historians still argue whether the anti-tea sentiment was genuine popular feeling or elite propaganda. Some scholars suggest that ordinary Americans never really cared about the political implications of their beverage choices. They drank what was available and affordable, which usually meant coffee since it was cheaper. Others argue that the patriotic rejection of tea was deeply felt and lasted for generations, only gradually wearing away as memories of the revolution faded. The shop owner is preparing another pot now, using a different variety of tea, and she invites you to compare. This one is lighter, more floral, imported from China rather than India. She explains the differences between the varieties with the enthusiasm of a true connoisseur, and you listen politely while your mind wanders to questions of public health. Like coffee, tea requires boiling water. Like coffee, tea therefore provides a measure of safety that unboiled beverages cannot match. The people drinking tea in this shop, in British-style establishments across America, in private homes where the tradition had been maintained, all of them were benefiting from the same accidental sterilization that coffee drinkers enjoyed. But there's an additional dimension to tea that coffee lacks. Tea has medicinal associations that go back centuries. Traditional Chinese medicine used tea to treat various ailments, and some of that lore made its way to Western consciousness. Tea was prescribed by physicians for digestive complaints, for nervous conditions, for general weakness and debility. Whether these prescriptions had any genuine efficacy is debatable, but they gave tea a health-conscious reputation that coffee never quite achieved. You finish your second cup and compliment the shop owner on her selection. She beams with pleasure and encourages you to return any time. The tea, she assures you, is always ready. Walking back out into the summer heat, you think about the complex relationship Americans have with their beverages. Coffee became patriotic by accident. Adopted as an alternative to politically tainted tea, tea became a somewhat rebellious choice, a refusal to follow the crowd, a quiet assertion that good taste matters more than nationalism. Both beverages offered the same fundamental benefit, safe, boiled water in a palatable form, but the cultural meanings attached to them were entirely different. The afternoon sun is at its peak now, and you're beginning to feel the effects of all that caffeine. Maybe something cooler would be appropriate. Maybe something without stimulants. You think about the various options available in this city, the constellation of beverages that people have devised to get through summer without dying. Milk comes to mind. Surely milk is safe. Surely something that comes from a cow, fresh and natural and nutritious, would be a healthy choice in this weather. You're about to discover that milk, in the 19th century, was possibly the most dangerous beverage of all. The dairy is located on a side street in a neighbourhood that smells like what you'd expect, a neighbourhood with a dairy to smell like. There are cattle here, kept in pens barely large enough for them to turn around, their mournful eyes watching you as you approach the establishment where their milk is sold. You had been thinking of milk as a wholesome, natural alternative to the various fermented and acidified and caffeinated beverages you've been exploring. Surely cow's milk, straight from the source, would be safer than water from a contaminated well. Surely nature herself would not betray you. But as you get closer to the dairy, as you observe the conditions under which these animals live, and the methods by which their milk is handled, you begin to revise your optimism. The cows are not healthy. That's the first thing you notice. Their ribs show through their hides. Their coats are dull and patchy. They stand in their own waste, having no room to escape it. And their food supply, you can see the buckets of it stacked near the pens, appears to be some kind of industrial byproduct. A grey-brown slop that looks nothing like the grass and grain you'd imagine cows eating. Here's the historical fact that will haunt you. You're looking at a swill dairy, one of the notorious urban milk operations that fed their cows on distillery waste. The leftover mash from whiskey and beer production, sold cheap to dairy farmers who cared more about profit than animal welfare. Swill milk, as the product of these operations was called, was thin, bluish, and virtually nutrition-free. To make it saleable, dairies would add chalk to whiten it, molasses to sweeten it, water to stretch it, and various other adulterants to approximate the appearance of real milk. And then there were the bacteria. The conditions you're observing, the filth, the warmth, the lack of refrigeration, the sick animals, created a perfect incubator for every pathogen imaginable. Tuberculosis spread from infected cows to humans through their milk. Typhoid and dysentery contaminated milk that was stored too long or handled by infected workers. Scarlet fever, diphtheria, and a dozen other diseases found their way into milk supplies that were never inspected, never tested, never held to any standard of safety. You decide not to buy any milk from this establishment. The decision feels instinctive, but it may have just saved your life. The swill dairy scandal was one of the great public health crises of 19th century America, though it took decades for reformers to bring it to widespread attention. In the 1850s and 1860s, journalists and physicians began documenting the conditions at urban dairies, publishing exposés that shocked the reading public. But change came slowly. The dairy industry was profitable, and its operators had political connections. Regulations were weak and poorly enforced. Contaminated milk continued to flow into American cities, killing children by the thousands. Here's a quirky detail that captures the dark comedy of milk adulteration. Some dairies added formaldehyde to their milk to prevent spoilage. Formaldehyde, a chemical used to embalm corpses. The logic was that if formaldehyde could preserve dead bodies, it could certainly preserve milk. And it worked, in a sense. Formaldehyde-laced milk did last longer without obviously spoiling. But the customers drinking it were slowly being poisoned by a substance that had no business in any beverage. You walk away from the dairy, your appetite for milk completely extinguished. The cows watch you go with their sad eyes, as if they know their fate is sealed. They'll produce swill milk until they're too sick to produce anything, and then they'll be slaughtered for meat that's probably not much safer than their milk. Historians still argue whether urban Americans of the 1840s understood how dangerous their milk supply was. Some evidence suggests that many people suspected something was wrong. The milk looked funny, tasted funny, seemed to cause more sickness than wholesome country milk. But the alternatives were limited. Fresh, safe milk from healthy cows required infrastructure that didn't exist in cities: pasture land, clean water, cold storage, transportation. The milk available to urban consumers was what the local dairies chose to provide, and the local dairies chose to provide poison. Children were the primary victims. Infant mortality in 19th century American cities was staggering, and a significant portion of those deaths can be attributed to contaminated milk. Babies who might have survived on breast milk often died when weaned onto bottle milk that carried diseases their tiny bodies couldn't fight. Parents who thought they were nourishing their children were actually killing them, one bottle at a time. The summer made everything worse, of course. Bacteria multiply faster in warm temperatures, and milk that might have been marginally safe in winter became deadly in July. The pattern was so consistent that physicians coined the term summer diarrhea to describe the infant deaths that peaked every hot season. They blamed the heat itself, or the bad air, or the constitution of children weakened by summer conditions. But the real culprit was milk, or rather the invisible armies of pathogens that swam through every cup. You find yourself on a busier street now, away from the smell of the dairy but still shaken by what you've seen. Milk, the beverage of innocence and health, revealed as a vehicle for disease and death. It challenges your assumptions about what natural means, about whether proximity to nature automatically confers safety. The irony is that milk could have been safe under different conditions. Milk from healthy cows collected cleanly, stored cold and consumed quickly poses minimal risk. The problem wasn't milk itself, but the system that produced it, a system optimized for profit, not safety, operating without regulation or oversight in an environment where no one understood the microbial forces at work. But that safe milk was available only to people lucky enough to live in the countryside, near farms that cared for their animals properly. City dwellers had to take what they could get, which usually meant swill milk and all its attendant horrors. You need a drink after that experience, something to wash the taste of knowledge from your mouth. But what? Not milk, certainly. Not water, with all its dangers. Maybe you'll go back to beer, the reliable old standby. Or maybe you'll explore something entirely different. The mysterious world of ice and cold storage that's beginning to transform American drinking habits. The sun continues to beat down, the day continues to demand hydration. And you continue to navigate the treacherous landscape of 19th century beverages, learning with each step how precarious survival was and how creative people had to be to make it through another summer. The heat of the afternoon drives you towards something you've been hearing about but haven't yet experienced. Ice. Real ice, harvested from frozen lakes, stored through the summer in massive ice houses, and sold to those wealthy enough to afford this miraculous substance that seems to defy the natural order of things. Ice in summer. Coldness when everything else is hot. It sounds almost magical. You find your way to an establishment that advertises ice cream and cold drinks. A shop on a fashionable street where well-dressed customers come and go with expressions of satisfied refreshment. The interior is noticeably cooler than the street outside, and you realise that the very walls must be insulated with ice, creating a pocket of winter in the middle of summer. The proprietor greets you with professional warmth and inquires what you'd like. You ask for the coldest drink he has, and he smiles as if you've said something amusing. Everything here is cold, he assures you. That's the whole point. What he serves you is lemonade, yes, lemonade again, but transformed by temperature into something almost unrecognisable. The glass frosts in your hand, the liquid is so cold it hurts your teeth, and the flavour, sharpened by the chill, is cleaner and more refreshing than anything you've tasted in your travels. You understand immediately why people will pay a premium for ice. Here's the historical fact that makes the ice trade possible. Ice is surprisingly shelf-stable if you store it correctly. A block of ice, cut from a northern lake in winter and packed in sawdust in a well-insulated ice house, can last through an entire summer with losses of maybe 20 or 30%. What remains can be sold in July and August at prices that make the whole elaborate system profitable. The ice trade was one of the great commercial innovations of 19th century America. It began in Massachusetts, where a businessman named Frederick Tudor looked at frozen lakes and saw not a winter inconvenience but a summer gold mine. He developed methods for cutting ice efficiently, storing it with minimal loss, and shipping it to hot climates where people would pay extraordinary amounts for something cold. By the 1840s, ice from New England was being shipped as far as India and the Caribbean, creating a global trade in frozen water. You sip your ice-cold lemonade and marvel at the system that made it possible. Somewhere to the north, men spent the winter cutting blocks of ice from frozen lakes, using horse-drawn saws and iron tools to harvest the frozen surface. They loaded the ice onto wagons and transported it to ice houses built along riverbanks and railroad lines. From there, it travelled south and west, following trade routes that had been optimised for maximum efficiency and minimum melt. Here's a quirky detail about the ice trade that captures its strange economics. Ice from Massachusetts was sometimes cheaper in the Caribbean than in nearby Boston. The reason was transportation. Ships heading south to pick up cargo would take ice as ballast, selling it in tropical ports for whatever price they could get. Meanwhile, overland transportation to inland American cities was expensive and difficult, making ice less accessible in Ohio than in Havana. Historians still argue whether the ice trade genuinely improved public health or simply created a new category of luxury consumption. Some scholars point to evidence that ice made milk safer by slowing bacterial growth, that ice-cooled beverages reduced the risk of contamination, that access to cold storage transformed food safety in cities that had previously suffered from spoilage and rot. Others note that ice was expensive and available mainly to the wealthy, that its benefits were concentrated among those who least needed help surviving summer, that the poor continued to drink warm, contaminated beverages while their richer neighbours enjoyed ice-cold refreshment. The proprietor of the shop is telling you about his ice supply. He gets it from an ice house on the edge of the city, delivered every other day in blocks that he stores in his cellar. The cellar is lined with sawdust and surrounded by double walls with air gaps for insulation. Even in the hottest weather, he can keep his shop at a comfortable temperature and his drinks genuinely cold. It's an impressive operation, and it represents the leading edge of what will eventually become refrigeration technology. A century from now, mechanical refrigeration will make ice harvesting obsolete, and every home will have a refrigerator that manufactures cold on demand. But for now, in the 1840s, cold is still a precious commodity that requires enormous infrastructure to produce and preserve. You finish your lemonade and consider ordering another. The shop is pleasant, the drink is excellent, and you're in no hurry to return to the baking streets outside. But you're also aware that this experience is available only because you have money in your pocket. The poor people of this city, the labourers and servants and struggling families, cannot afford ice-cold drinks on a regular basis. They're still dependent on warm beer and tepid cider, and whatever water they can convince themselves is safe. The ice trade, for all its ingenuity, did not solve the problem of summer hydration for most Americans. It created a parallel world of cold beverages that the wealthy could inhabit, while everyone else continued to suffer. The democratic promise of universal safe drinking water remained unfulfilled, waiting for technologies and systems that hadn't yet been invented. Still, you're grateful for this moment of refreshment. The cold lemonade has revived you in a way that no warm beverage could match. Your body temperature has dropped perceptibly, and the headache that was threatening earlier has receded. Ice may not be available to everyone, but for those who can access it, it's transformative. You pay your bill and step back out into the heat. The contrast is almost painful, the cool oasis of the ice cream shop giving way immediately to the brutal reality of summer. You're sweating again within seconds, your body recalibrating to the temperature that everyone else has been enduring all along. But you carry the memory of coldness with you, the knowledge that such relief is possible even in the worst heat. And you understand now why people became so obsessed with ice, why the ice trade became one of the great commercial success stories of the 19th century. Cold is not just pleasant, it's powerful. It changes your relationship with the environment, gives you control over something that usually controls you. The day is getting late, and you have more beverages to explore before this journey is complete. But you'll remember this shop, this lemonade, this taste of winter in the middle of summer. In a world full of dangerous drinks, sometimes the safest thing is the coldest thing. Evening is approaching as you wander into a part of the city you haven't explored yet, a neighbourhood of smaller shops and quieter streets, where the bustle of commerce gives way to something more residential. It's here that you notice a curious establishment, a storefront with bottles in the window, each bearing elaborate labels promising health, vigour, and protection against disease. You found a patent medicine shop, purveyor of bottled remedies that promise to solve every problem known to 19th century humanity. And what catches your eye specifically is a display advertising pure spring water tonic, nature's own remedy for summer complaints. You step inside, drawn by curiosity about what exactly a pure spring water tonic might contain. The proprietor, a man with the smooth manner of a born salesman, welcomes you warmly and inquires about your needs. You explain that you're interested in the tonic, and his eyes light up with enthusiasm. The tonic, he explains, is water. But not just any water. It's spring water, collected from a pristine source in the mountains, untouched by the contamination that plagues city wells and rivers, and it's enhanced with special mineral compounds that strengthen the constitution and protect against the miasmas that cause summer sickness. He gestures to testimonials posted on the wall, dozens of customers who swear the tonic saved their lives. Here's the historical fact that makes patent medicine so fascinating and so troubling. There was essentially no regulation of what could be put in a bottle and sold as medicine in 19th century America. No ingredient lists were required. No testing for safety or efficacy was mandated. Anyone with access to bottles and labels could become a medicine manufacturer, selling whatever concoction they could convince people to buy. The spring water tonic you're being offered might actually be spring water, in which case it's probably no safer than any other water unless it happens to come from a genuinely uncontaminated source. But it might also contain alcohol. Many patent medicines were essentially flavoured booze, with alcohol contents ranging from wine strength to whiskey strength. Or it might contain opium or cocaine, or any number of other substances that 19th century manufacturers freely added to their products. You ask the proprietor, as casually as you can, what exactly is in the tonic. He smiles and explains that the formula is proprietary, a family secret passed down through generations. But he assures you it contains nothing harmful, only the pure gifts of nature, enhanced by scientific knowledge. The price, he adds, is quite reasonable given the protection it offers. Here's a quirky detail that captures the Wild West nature of patent medicine marketing. Some manufacturers actually added colour-changing chemicals to their products, so that the tonic would change colour when mixed with water or exposed to air. This had no medical purpose whatsoever. It was pure theatre, designed to convince customers that something powerful was happening. The chemistry was real, the health benefits were not. Historians still argue whether patent medicine customers were gullible victims or rational actors working with limited information. Some scholars emphasise the desperation of people facing diseases they didn't understand, willing to try anything that offered hope. Others point out that patent medicines were sometimes the only available treatment, that regular physicians of the era weren't necessarily any more effective, and that choosing a bottled remedy was no more foolish than trusting a doctor who believed in bloodletting and purging. You decide not to buy the spring water tonic. The salesman's smoothness makes you suspicious, and you've learned enough about this era's medical marketplace to be cautious. But you thank him for his time and spend a few more minutes examining the other products on his shelves. The variety is astounding. There are tonics for digestion, tonics for nerves, tonics for female complaints, tonics for children, tonics for the elderly. There are remedies promising to cure consumption, cholera, dysentery, and the vague category of summer sickness. There are products marketed as alternatives to alcohol, and products that are quite obviously alcohol in disguise. Many of these products make specific claims about water safety. They promise to purify water, to neutralize poisons, to make contaminated sources drinkable. The bottles are covered with pseudo-scientific language, activated mineral compounds, purifying agents, natural defenses. That sounds impressive but means nothing. People bought these products because they wanted to believe, because they needed something to trust in an environment where trust was hard to come by. The tragedy is that some patent medicines probably did help some people some of the time. A tonic with alcohol in it might have been safer than contaminated water, even if the alcohol was undisclosed. A product with herbs that happened to have antimicrobial properties might have prevented some infections. The complete absence of regulation meant that the market was a lottery. Some products were helpful, some were useless, some were actively dangerous, and the consumer had no way to tell which was which. You leave the shop and stand on the sidewalk thinking about the burden of knowledge that people in this era didn't carry. They didn't know about germs, they didn't know about bacterial contamination, they didn't know why some drinks were safer than others. All they had was observation and rumour and the persuasive claims of salesmen like the one you just met. In that environment, buying a patent medicine tonic made a kind of desperate sense. You were choosing something, taking action, asserting control over your health. The alternative, drinking from the same questionable wells as everyone else and hoping for the best, felt too passive, too resigned to fate. At least with the tonic, you were doing something. The evening light is fading now, painting the shop windows in shades of gold. Tomorrow you'll continue your exploration, but for now, you're tired and ready for rest. The patent medicine shop has given you something to think about. The complex relationship between hope and exploitation, between medicine and marketing, between the desperate need to survive and the people willing to profit from that desperation. You head back toward your lodgings, walking through streets that are quieter now as the city prepares for night. Somewhere in this city, people are drinking patent medicine tonics and praying they work. Somewhere else, people are drinking from contaminated wells because they can't afford anything better. And everywhere, the invisible forces of contamination and disease continue their patient work, indifferent to human hopes and human commerce. Morning arrives with news that's been circulating through the city. A Mineral Springs resort has announced special rates for visitors seeking relief from the summer heat. The announcement has generated considerable excitement among those who can afford such luxuries. and you decide to make the trip to see for yourself what the fuss is about. The journey takes you out of the city and into the countryside, following roads that wind through increasingly pleasant scenery. The air grows fresher as you leave the urban stench behind, and by the time you reach your destination, you feel as though you've travelled not just in space but in time, to someplace older, cleaner, more connected to the natural world. The resort is built around a natural spring that bubbles up from the earth, producing water that's naturally carbonated and mineral-rich. This is not ordinary water, the resort's literature assures you. This is healing water, blessed with properties that cure everything from indigestion to nervous exhaustion. Visitors come from hundreds of miles to drink from the spring and bathe in its waters, seeking the restoration that modern life has stolen from them. You join a group of guests at the spring itself, where an attendant offers cups of the fabled water. The spring emerges from a decorative stone structure that makes it look vaguely classical, as if the Romans themselves might have bathed here. The water that flows from it is clear but fizzy, tiny bubbles rising through it like champagne. You taste it. The mineral content is immediately apparent. There's a sharpness, a complexity, that ordinary water lacks. It's not unpleasant exactly, but it's definitely not what you'd call refreshing. It tastes like water that's done something, water that's picked up flavours and compounds on its journey through underground rock formations. Here's the historical fact that made mineral springs so popular in 19th century America. People genuinely believed these waters had therapeutic properties, and the medical establishment generally agreed. Physicians prescribed visits to mineral springs for all manner of ailments, and the springs themselves were organised into a hierarchy based on the specific minerals they contained. Some were famous for their iron content, said to strengthen the blood. Others were known for sulphur, believed to purify the system. Still others were prized for their carbonation, which supposedly aided digestion. The spa culture that developed around these springs was part medicine, part social ritual, part escape from the unpleasantness of urban life. Wealthy families would spend weeks or even months at mineral springs resorts, drinking the waters, bathing in them, and enjoying the company of other wealthy families doing the same thing. It was a world unto itself, removed from the heat and disease and crowding of the cities. Here's a quirky detail about mineral springs that the promoters didn't emphasize. The waters were not necessarily safer than ordinary water. Natural springs could be contaminated by surface runoff, by animals, by the very geological formations that gave them their distinctive minerals. The belief that spring water was automatically pure was a myth, albeit a persistent one. Some springs probably were cleaner than urban water sources simply by virtue of their isolation. Others were no better or worse. Historians still argue whether the reported health benefits of mineral springs were real or placebo. Some scholars point to the genuine therapeutic effects of certain minerals, particularly for specific conditions. Others argue that the benefits people reported were largely due to rest, fresh air, improved diet, and escape from the stresses of daily life. That the water itself was incidental to the overall experience of spa treatment. You walk through the resort grounds, observing the other guests. They are a prosperous-looking bunch, dressed in summer whites that would be ruined in minutes on a city street, but that stay immaculate here where the paths are swept and the carriages are kept at a respectful distance. They move slowly, deliberately, as if hurrying would be somehow unseemly. The whole atmosphere suggests leisure of a kind that most Americans of this era could only dream about. The resort offers other beverages besides spring water, you discover. There's a tea room serving hot and cold teas, a bar that discreetly provides spirits for those who want them, and a soda fountain, one of the newer innovations in American drinking culture. You make your way to the soda fountain, curious to see what's on offer. What you find is a gleaming marble counter, behind which a young man in a white coat presides over an array of pumps and spigots and bottles of syrup. This is the cutting edge of beverage technology in the 1840s, artificially carbonated water, flavoured with various syrups served cold over ice. The soda fountain is half pharmacy, half social club, and entirely fascinating. You order something called a cream soda, and what arrives is nothing like the cream soda of the modern world. It's foamy, yes, and sweet, but there's a complexity to it that suggests actual cream rather than artificial flavouring. The carbonation tickles your nose as you drink. The sweetness is gentle rather than overwhelming. It's actually quite good. The soda fountain represents the democratization of what the mineral springs offered naturally. Can't travel to a fashionable resort to drink naturally carbonated water? No problem. Here's artificially carbonated water, available at pharmacies and soda fountains in cities and towns across America. The carbonation was believed to have its own health benefits, independent of minerals, and soda water became popular among those who wanted the fizz without the journey. You finish your cream soda and leave the soda fountain feeling pleasantly refreshed. The resort has been an education in how the wealthy of this era managed their hydration needs, with money, with travel, with elaborate rituals of health and leisure. It's a world away from the swill dairies and contaminated wells you've seen elsewhere, but it's all part of the same story. The story is this. In a world where water could kill you, people found endless ways to seek something safer. Some of those ways were expensive, accessible only to the privileged few. Others were cheap and available to almost anyone, but all of them reflected the same fundamental human drive to survive, to find solutions, to keep drinking even when drinking was dangerous. You begin the journey back to the city, your mind full of bubbles and minerals and the strange economics of health. The resort recedes behind you, a green oasis that will continue to welcome the wealthy while the urban poor continue to struggle with their contaminated wells. It's not fair, you think. But it's also not surprising. Back in the city, you follow up on something you noticed at the Mineral Springs Resort, the soda fountain. It intrigued you, this marriage of pharmacy and refreshment, and you want to understand it better. So you seek out one of the city's established soda fountains, located in a pharmacy on a busy commercial street. The pharmacy is larger than you expected, with shelves of medicines lining the walls and a prescription counter where serious-looking men in spectacles fill orders. But the main attraction is clearly the soda fountain at the front of the shop, where a crowd has gathered despite the early hour. People of all types are drinking from the gleaming equipment, well-dressed ladies, working men on their breaks, children with coins clutched in their hands. You join the queue and watch the fountain operator at work. He's a master of his craft, moving between pumps and spigots with practiced efficiency, mixing flavours on the fly, serving customers with a patter of friendly conversation. The fountain itself is a beautiful piece of equipment, all polished metal and coloured glass, looking more like a work of art than a dispensing machine. When your turn comes, you ask for a recommendation. The operator sizes you up with a professional eye and suggests a phosphate, carbonated water mixed with fruit syrup and a dash of acid phosphate, a compound that adds a pleasant tartness and is supposed to aid digestion. You accept his recommendation and watch as he constructs the drink with elaborate care. Here's the historical fact that makes soda fountains significant in the story of American drinking. They were pharmacies first and refreshment stands second. The carbonated water that formed the base of every soda was originally sold as a health product, not a pleasure product. Pharmacists believed that carbonation had genuine medicinal properties, and they offered soda water as a treatment for digestive complaints before anyone thought to add flavouring. The transition from medicine to refreshment happened gradually, as pharmacists discovered that flavoured soda sold better than plain soda. A spoonful of sugar helped the medicine go down, and eventually the sugar became more important than the supposed medicine. By the 1840s, soda fountains were as much about entertainment as about health, though the medical association lingered in the public imagination. The phosphate arrives, and it's delicious. The carbonation is aggressive, more so than the naturally carbonated mineral water you tried at the resort. The fruit flavour is bright and clear, probably cherry or some berry, and the acid phosphate adds a complexity that makes you want another sip immediately. You understand now why people gather at soda fountains. This is genuinely good stuff, refreshing and novel in a way that beer and cider can't match. Here's a quirky detail about early soda fountain culture that explains its surprising popularity. Soda fountains were respectable places where women could go unescorted. In an era when taverns were male spaces, and unaccompanied women in public were viewed with suspicion, the soda fountain offered a socially acceptable venue for refreshment. Women could meet friends at the soda fountain, could treat themselves to flavoured sodas, could enjoy a public outing without risking their reputations. This made soda fountains important social institutions, not just beverage providers. Historians still argue whether soda fountain beverages were actually safer than other drinks available in the 19th century. Some scholars point out that the carbonated water was made by adding carbon dioxide to ordinary water, which wouldn't necessarily remove any contamination. Others note that the equipment used to produce carbonated water often involved heating, which would kill some pathogens. and that the acidic nature of many fountain drinks might have inhibited bacterial growth. The truth is probably that soda fountain beverages were neither dramatically safer nor dramatically more dangerous than the alternatives. They were simply different, and their novelty was part of their appeal. You finish your phosphate and order a second, this time asking for a different flavour. The operator recommends ginger and you agree. The ginger phosphate is spicier, more warming despite being cold, and it reminds you of the switchel you tried in the countryside. There's something about ginger that humans across cultures have recognised as beneficial, something that settles stomachs and invigorates bodies. The pharmacy around you buzzes with activity. Customers consult with pharmacists about remedies for various ailments. Prescriptions are filled behind the counter, and through it all the soda fountain continues to draw its crowd, providing refreshment to people who have come for medicine and discovered something better. The soda fountain represents a peculiar American institution that would flourish for the next century before declining in the face of bottled soft drinks and fast food restaurants. At its peak, the soda fountain would be a fixture of American life, as familiar as the post office or the general store, but you're seeing it in its early days, when the equipment is still being perfected and the flavours are still being invented. You pay for your phosphates and leave the pharmacy feeling pleasantly buzzed from the sugar and carbonation. The city street seems a little more manageable now, the heat a little less oppressive. You found another weapon in the arsenal of summer survival, another way to stay hydrated without dying. The soda fountain won't save everyone, of course. Like the ice trade, like the mineral springs resorts, it's primarily available to those with money. The poor continue to rely on whatever they can afford, which often means water of questionable safety. But for the growing middle class of American cities, the soda fountain offers something new. Refreshment without risk, pleasure without guilt, a moment of cold sweetness in a hot and dangerous world. You walk on, thinking about how these various solutions to the drinking problem sort themselves by class and geography. The wealthy have their mineral springs, the middle class has its soda fountains, the working poor has its beer, and everyone, at some level, is just trying to make it through the summer without getting sick. The soda fountain has left you thinking about the complex relationship between pleasure and morality in 19th century America, which brings you inevitably to the temperance movement. You've been hearing about it throughout your travels, the growing force of reformers who insist that alcohol, in all its forms, is the root of social evil and must be eliminated from American life. You decide to attend a temperance meeting which you've learned is happening this evening at a church on the edge of the commercial district. The experience promises to be illuminating, even if you're not planning to sign any pledges. The church is full when you arrive, with a diverse crowd that surprises you. You expected pious matrons and stern ministers, but the audience includes working men, young women, families with children, people of various social classes united by a common cause. At the front of the room, speakers are preparing their notes, and an air of righteous anticipation fills the space. The first speaker launches into a catalogue of alcohol's horrors. Drink destroys families, he thunders. Drink impoverishes the working man. Drink leads to violence, to madness, to early death. The audience responds with murmurs of agreement, with occasional shouts of "Amen!" with the energy of people who have seen the damage alcohol can do and want it stopped. Here's the historical fact that makes the temperance movement complicated for your understanding of summer drinking. Alcohol wasn't just a pleasure or a vice in this era, it was a survival strategy. The weak beer and cider that kept people alive through contaminated summers, these were exactly the beverages that temperance reformers wanted to eliminate. They saw the harm alcohol caused and demanded abstinence, without fully understanding the role alcohol played in keeping people safe from an even deadlier threat. The second speaker takes a different approach, focusing on the alternatives to alcohol. God has provided pure water for his children, she proclaims. Water is all we need. The rivers and wells and springs that he has given us are sufficient for every thirst. To turn to alcohol is to reject God's gift, to prefer human corruption over divine provision. You listen with complicated feelings. She's wrong about the water, you know. The rivers and wells she celebrates are often contaminated, often dangerous, often deadly. The divine provision she praises has killed more people than alcohol ever did. But you also understand why she believes what she believes. The germ theory of disease doesn't exist yet. The invisible dangers in water are truly invisible. All she can see is the visible damage that alcohol causes, the drunkenness, the violence, the broken families, and she draws the obvious conclusion. Here's a quirky detail about the temperance movement that captures its earnest impracticality. Some temperance advocates developed elaborate alternatives to alcohol, concoctions designed to provide refreshment without intoxication. These included beverages made from grains but unfermented, drinks flavoured with herbs and spices, and various fruit-based potions that tried to capture the appeal of cider and wine without the alcohol. Most of these alternatives were not successful. People tried them, found them inadequate, and quietly returned to their beer and cider, while publicly supporting the temperance cause. Historians still argue whether the temperance movement helped or harmed public health in 19th century America. Some scholars point to the genuine damage that alcohol abuse caused, particularly in an era of cheap and potent spirits, and credit temperance advocates with reducing that damage. Others note that temperance often pushed people toward less safe beverages, that the movement's moralism obscured the practical realities of hydration, and that the eventual triumph of prohibition in the 20th century caused more problems than it solved. The meeting continues with testimonials from reformed drinkers, with hymns sung in fervent voices, with pledges signed by people promising to abstain from alcohol forever. The emotional intensity is genuine, even if the science is lacking. These people truly believe they're fighting for a better world, and in some ways they are. You slip out before the meeting ends, having seen enough to understand the dynamic. The temperance movement represents a collision between two different kinds of danger: the visible danger of alcohol abuse and the invisible danger of contaminated water. People could see drunks staggering through the streets, could see families destroyed by addiction, could see the social harm that drink inflicted. They couldn't see the bacteria swimming in their wells, couldn't see the pathogens multiplying in their cisterns, couldn't see the microscopic forces that made alcohol the safer choice. The irony is profound. The temperance reformers wanted to save lives, and in pursuing that goal they may have inadvertently endangered lives. The path to hell, as the saying goes, is paved with good intentions, and the path to typhoid fever, it turns out, is paved with pure water. You walk back to your lodgings through streets that are quieter now, the evening crowd having dispersed. Somewhere in the city, temperance advocates are celebrating another successful meeting, another crop of pledges, another step toward the alcohol-free society they imagine. And somewhere else, people are drinking contaminated water because they've been told that alcohol is sinful, and some of those people will be dead within the week. The complexity of it all weighs on you. There are no easy answers in this era, no obvious solutions that don't create new problems. The drinking question is tangled up with morality and economics and science and religion, and no single perspective captures the whole truth. You climb the stairs to your room and prepare for sleep. Tomorrow will bring more heat, more thirst, more calculations about what to drink. But tonight, you're just tired. Tired of choices, tired of dangers, tired of a world where something as simple as quenching thirst can be so complicated. Morning comes with rain, finally blessed rain, breaking the heat wave that's been punishing the city. You stand at your window and watch the water pour from the sky, a gift from heaven that the temperance advocates might point to as proof that God provides. And indeed you see people in the street turning their faces up to the rain, mouths open, drinking directly from the sky. But you're thinking about something else now. Where does all this water go? The rain that's falling on the city will flow somewhere, will collect somewhere, will end up in someone's water supply. Understanding that system seems suddenly important. You spend the day visiting the infrastructure of urban water, the wells and cisterns and pumps that ordinary families rely on for their daily needs. It's not glamorous exploration, but it's essential to understanding why water so often goes bad in cities. The first well you examine is in a courtyard behind a row of houses. It's a simple structure, a stone-lined shaft descending into the earth, topped with a wooden cover, and equipped with a rope and bucket for drawing water. Families from the surrounding houses share this well, taking turns to haul up water for cooking and drinking and washing. The water table here, you learn from talking to residents, is about 20 feet down. That sounds like a reasonable depth, deep enough to filter out surface contamination, to provide something clean and safe. But as you look around the courtyard, you notice something troubling. There's a privy not 30 feet away, and another one around the corner. The cesspools that receive the waste from these privies are seeping slowly into the same ground that supplies the well. Here's the historical fact that makes urban wells so dangerous. The people who built these systems didn't understand the connections between things. A well and a privy might be on opposite sides of a courtyard, which seemed like adequate separation. But underground, the water flows where it will, carrying contamination from cesspools to wells, without regard for property lines or human intentions. What people deposited in their privies, they often ended up drinking from their wells. The residents you talk to are aware that the water sometimes smells bad, especially in summer, but they don't connect this to the nearby privies. They blame the heat, the stagnation, the mysterious miasmas that everyone knows cause disease. The idea that their own waste might be poisoning their water supply doesn't occur to them, and would be rejected if suggested, because the implications are too horrifying to contemplate. You move on to examine a cistern, another common feature of urban water infrastructure. This one is in the basement of a middle-class home, a brick-lined tank that collects rainwater from the roof. The homeowner is proud of it. She explains that rainwater is purer than well water, softer and better for washing, and perfectly safe for drinking if you let it settle before use. Here's a quirky detail about cistern water that the homeowner doesn't mention. The water that flows into her cistern passes over her roof first, picking up whatever has accumulated there. Bird droppings, dead leaves, insects, and their larvae. Anything that the wind has deposited. The cistern is essentially a collection point for roof debris, and while some of that debris settles to the bottom, plenty of it remains suspended in the water she's drinking. Historians still argue whether cistern water was generally safer or more dangerous than well water. Some scholars point out that rainwater starts pure and only becomes contaminated through collection and storage, suggesting that a well-maintained cistern might be safer than a well situated near cesspools. Others note that cisterns provided ideal conditions for bacterial growth, still water, organic matter, summer warmth, and that outbreaks of disease were sometimes traced to specific cisterns. You leave the homeowner's basement and walk through the rainy streets, thinking about the improvised nature of urban water systems. There's no central authority managing water quality. There are no standards, no inspections, no requirements that wells be situated safely away from sources of contamination. Every household makes its own arrangements, and those arrangements are only as good as the knowledge and resources available to the people making them. The rain continues to fall, and you watch it flowing through gutters, gathering in puddles, eventually draining into the ground or the sewers or the rivers. This is the water cycle that people depend on. Rain becomes groundwater, becomes well water, becomes drinking water, becomes wastewater, becomes groundwater again. It's a cycle that can purify water under the right conditions, but that can also circulate contamination endlessly under the wrong conditions. The urban conditions of the 1840s are very much the wrong conditions. Too many people, too many privies, too little understanding of how disease spreads. The wells and cisterns that supply the city are connected in invisible ways to the waste that the city produces. People drink without knowing what they're drinking, and the consequences are written in mortality statistics that no one knows how to interpret. You find shelter under an awning and stand watching the rain, which is beginning to lighten now. The air feels cleaner, fresher, as if the storm has washed away some of the city's accumulated grime. But you know that the water falling from this cleaner sky is destined for the same compromised infrastructure, the same contaminated wells, the same dangerous cycle. Summer rain is a temporary relief, not a solution. The underlying problems remain, waiting for understanding that hasn't yet arrived. And the people of this city continue to drink what's available, hoping that what's available won't kill them. The rain stops as suddenly as it started, and the sun begins to break through the clouds. Steam rises from the wet streets. The heat is returning, and somewhere in the city, someone is drawing water from a well that's about to make them very, very sick. The rain has cleared, but you find yourself drawn toward the river, the great waterway that serves as the city's primary artery of commerce, and for many residents, its primary source of drinking water. You need to see it with your own eyes to understand why something so apparently abundant could be so dangerous. The riverside is busy with activity. Docks extend into the water, where ships unload cargo from distant ports. Warehouses line the shore, storing goods that will eventually make their way into the city's markets. And everywhere there are people, working, watching, living their lives in close proximity to the water that sustains and threatens them simultaneously. You walk out onto one of the docks and look down at the river itself. The water is brown. Not the clear brown of a clean river with a muddy bottom, but a murky, opaque brown that suggests things you'd rather not think about. The surface is covered with a thin film of something oily, and here and there you can see debris floating past. Broken crates, dead animals, unidentifiable masses of organic matter. And the smell. You noticed it as you approached, but up close it's overwhelming. The river smells like a combination of every bad smell you can imagine. Rotting vegetation, animal waste, industrial chemicals, the accumulated sewage of 100,000 people who have nowhere else to put their waste. This is not water. This is soup, a toxic stew of everything the city wants to forget about. Here's the historical fact that makes the river situation so appalling. Many of the city's residents drink from this river. Not directly, usually. They're not that desperate. But through pumping stations and pipes that draw water from the river and distribute it to neighbourhoods where wells have failed or never existed. The water is sometimes filtered through sandbeds, sometimes treated with various substances that are supposed to purify it, but often it arrives in homes essentially unchanged from its state in the river. The logic seems insane, but consider the alternatives. The wells are contaminated, the cisterns are limited, the springs are far away. The ice trade provides cold drinks, but not clean ones. For many urban residents, the river is the only water source that can meet demand in quantity, even if the quality is horrifying. You talk to a boatman who's sitting on the dock mending a net. He's been working this river his whole life, he tells you, and he wouldn't dream of drinking from it. The fishermen and boatmen have their own sources. They know which springs are clean, which wells are safe, which taverns serve beer made with water from outside the city. But the people in the tenements, the poor families who can't afford alternatives, they drink the river water and they die from it, and more people move in to replace them. Here's a quirky detail about river water that captures the desperate improvisation of urban water management. Some cities experimented with floating intake pipes farther out into the river, reasoning that the water in the middle was cleaner than the water near the banks. This was partially true. The main current did carry away some contamination faster than the stagnant water near shore, but it was hardly a solution. The entire river was polluted, just with varying degrees of intensity. Historians still argue whether urban residents understood how dangerous their river water was. Some evidence suggests widespread awareness. Complaints about water quality fill the newspapers and public records of the era, and proposals for improvement were constantly being debated. Other evidence suggests resignation rather than awareness. People drank river water because they had no choice, not because they believed it was safe, and they didn't bother complaining because they didn't expect anything to change. You leave the dock and walk along the riverbank, passing through neighbourhoods that grow progressively poorer as you move away from the commercial centre. Here, the connection between the river and daily life is even more intimate. Women wash clothes in the river, children play at its edge, and yes, people draw water from the river directly, using buckets and ropes, preferring immediate access to the unreliable alternatives. A man is filling buckets from the river as you watch. You want to stop him, to explain the danger, but what would you say? That the water is contaminated with invisible organisms that will make him sick? He wouldn't believe you. The concept doesn't exist yet, not in any way he could understand. That the river is full of sewage? He can see that with his own eyes, but what choice does he have? The terrible truth is that knowledge without alternatives is just another form of despair. The people drinking river water aren't doing so out of ignorance, at least not entirely. They're doing so because they're poor, because they're trapped, because the systems that should provide them with safe water have failed them utterly. Telling them their water is dangerous accomplishes nothing if you can't offer them something better. The sun is setting over the river now, casting orange light across the polluted surface in a way that's almost beautiful if you don't think about what's underneath. Another day is ending in this city, another day of people drinking what they must and hoping for the best. The river flows on, carrying its cargo of waste and contamination toward the sea. Cities downstream will drink from this same water, adding their own pollution before passing it along. It's a chain of contamination that extends for hundreds of miles, connecting communities that have never heard of each other through the invisible bonds of shared water. You turn away from the river and begin walking back toward the centre of the city. Tomorrow you'll explore more of this complex landscape of beverages and dangers. But tonight, you'll try to find something to drink that didn't come from that river. Something that won't make you one more statistic in the summer mortality tables. The problem of contaminated water has been nagging at you, and you've heard rumours of a solution, a new technology that some cities are experimenting with. They call it filtration, and you want to see it for yourself. Your inquiries lead you to a facility on the edge of the city, where engineers are attempting something that sounds almost miraculous, taking polluted river water and making it safe to drink. The The facility is not impressive to look at, a collection of brick buildings and large tanks. But what happens inside represents the cutting edge of public health technology. A young engineer agrees to show you around, eager to explain the system he's helped build. The process, he tells you, starts with settling tanks. River water is pumped into large basins where it sits for several hours, allowing the heaviest particles to sink to the bottom. This removes the most obvious contamination, the mud, the debris, the larger organic matter, and produces water that at least looks cleaner. From there, the water moves to the filtration beds, layers of sand and gravel through which the water slowly percolates. The sand acts as a physical filter, trapping particles that are too small to settle out on their own. The process is slow but effective, and the water that emerges from the other side is dramatically clearer than what went in. Here's the historical fact that makes sand filtration significant. It actually worked. Not perfectly, not completely, but measurably. Cities that implemented sand filtration saw reductions in waterborne disease, even though no one quite understood why. The sand was removing more than just visible particles. It was removing bacteria, trapping them in the fine spaces between grains, preventing them from reaching the people who would drink the water. The engineer is proud of his facility, and he has reason to be. He's part of a movement that will eventually transform public health, providing cities with clean water through engineering solutions rather than individual choices. But he's also aware of the limitations. The filtration system is expensive to build and maintain. It can only handle a limited volume of water, and some contamination makes it through anyway, especially during peak demand when water moves through the filters faster than it should. Here's a quirky detail about early filtration systems that reveals how little people understood about what they were doing. Some engineers believed that the sand itself had purifying properties, that there was something special about the mineral composition that neutralized poisons. Others thought the filtration was entirely mechanical, that the sand simply strained out particles of a certain size. No one understood that bacterial communities forming in the sand were actually doing much of the purification work, consuming organic matter and trapping pathogens in a living biological filter. Historians still argue whether early filtration systems were worth the investment compared to other interventions. Some scholars point to the documented health improvements in cities with filtration and argue that the technology saved countless lives. Others note that many cities built inadequate systems, that maintenance was often poor, and that false confidence in filtration may have delayed other improvements that would have been more effective. You leave the filtration facility with mixed feelings. On one hand, you've witnessed genuine progress, a systematic attempt to solve the water problem through engineering rather than luck. On the other hand, you've seen how limited that progress is, how expensive, how dependent on factors that the engineers themselves don't fully understand. The people of the 1840s are groping towards solutions, trying things and seeing what works, making improvements without understanding why they help. This is how progress happens in the absence of fundamental knowledge, slowly, haltingly, with many false starts and dead ends. The germ theory that would eventually explain why filtration works is still decades away. Until then, people will continue to experiment, to debate, to build systems that may or may not save lives. You walk back toward the city centre, passing through neighbourhoods that draw their water from the very river you saw yesterday. These people don't have access to filtered water. They don't have access to the experiments and improvements happening at the facility you just visited. They have the same contaminated wells and rivers that their parents and grandparents relied on, and they'll continue to rely on them until something changes. The inequality of water access parallels all the other inequalities of this era. The wealthy can afford filtered water, ice, mineral springs, and all the other alternatives that money can buy. The poor drink what's available and die at rates that would be unacceptable if anyone were paying attention to the statistics. But attention is slowly building. The filtration facility you visited is just one sign of a growing awareness that water quality matters, that public health is a public responsibility, that cities cannot continue to poison their residents and expect to prosper. The changes will come too slowly for the people dying now, but they will come. You find a tavern and order a beer, retreating to the familiar safety of fermented grain. The beer tastes the same as it did when your journey started, but you appreciate it differently now. You understand why it's safe, even if the bartender doesn't. You understand why people drink it instead of water, even if they couldn't explain their reasoning. You've seen the alternatives, and the alternatives are often deadly. The The summer continues, the heat will return tomorrow or the day after, and the cycle of thirst and contamination will continue. But somewhere, in filtration facilities and engineering offices and public health departments, people are working on solutions. The future is coming, even if it's taking its time. You've been spending most of your time among native-born Americans, but the city you're exploring is home to immigrants from many nations, each bringing their own traditions and knowledge about what to drink. Today, you're going to explore those immigrant drinking cultures, starting with a visit to a German neighbourhood on the city's east side. The streets here have a different character than the ones you've been walking. The signs are in German, the smells from the kitchens are different, and the pace of life feels subtly altered. You pass a beer garden where families are gathered despite the heat, drinking from large steins and conversing in the musical rhythms of German speech. You take a seat at an outdoor table and order what everyone else seems to be drinking. The beer that arrives is different from the American beer you've been consuming, heavier, more complex, served in quantities that suggest long afternoons of slow drinking rather than quick refreshment. Here's the historical fact that makes German immigration significant for American drinking culture. The Germans brought with them centuries of brewing knowledge that would eventually transform American beer. They brewed lagers instead of ales, using bottom-fermenting yeasts and longer aging times that produced a cleaner, crisper product. They built breweries that would become some of the largest in the nation, and they established a drinking culture centered on the beer garden, where beer was consumed in social settings that emphasized moderation and community. The German approach to beer was different from the American approach in subtle but important ways. Americans tended to drink in taverns, often quickly and to excess. Germans drank in beer gardens, usually slowly and with food, in the company of family and neighbours. The German beer garden was a respectable place, even for women and children, in a way that American taverns often were not. You strike up a conversation with the family at the next table, who are happy to explain their drinking traditions to an interested stranger. They drink beer because it's safe, they tell you, the same reason Americans drink it. But they also drink it because it's part of their culture, their identity, their connection to the homeland they left behind. Beer is not just hydration for them, it's heritage. Here's a quirky detail about German-American drinking that captures the cultural collision between traditions. German immigrants were often confused by American temperance movements, which seemed to target a form of social drinking that Germans considered perfectly respectable. The beer garden, with its families and moderation and focus on food as much as drink, was nothing like the American saloon with its solitary drinkers and quick intoxication. Germans felt they were being condemned for sins they weren't committing. Historians still argue whether German-American brewing actually improved American beer or simply replaced one tradition with another. Some scholars credit Germans with professionalizing American brewing, introducing quality standards and technical knowledge that raised the overall standard. Others note that German dominance led to the disappearance of regional American brewing traditions, creating a more homogeneous beer culture that would eventually be dominated by a handful of large producers. You finish your beer and move on, crossing the city to an Irish neighbourhood where the drinking culture has its own distinctive character. The Irish pub you enter is darker than the beer garden, more intimate, with a counter rather than tables as the focus of social life. The Irish drink whiskey, of course. It's the national beverage, the immigrant's connection to the old country. But you're surprised to discover that the Irish also have strong tea traditions. Tea was expensive in Ireland, a luxury that the poor could rarely afford, but it was central to Irish hospitality. Offering tea to a visitor was a sign of respect, and immigrants brought this tradition with them to America. The publican, when you ask about drinking customs, explains that the Irish approach to hydration is pragmatic. They drink what's available and what they can afford. In the old country, that often meant nothing but water or milk, both of which were safer in rural Ireland than in American cities. In America, they've adapted to local conditions, drinking beer and spirits, while maintaining their love of tea when they can get it. You leave the Irish pub and continue your exploration, passing through an Italian neighbourhood where wine is the beverage of choice. The Italians, you learn, find American beer watery and unsatisfying. They prefer the stronger flavours of wine, which they sometimes make themselves from grapes they cultivate in tiny backyard plots. Wine was safer than water in Italy, just as beer was safer in Northern Europe, and the habit travels with the immigrants. Each community you visit has its own relationship with alcohol, its own traditions, its own ways of staying hydrated without getting sick. The city is a patchwork of drinking cultures, each one reflecting a different history and a different set of solutions to the universal problem of safe beverages. What strikes you most is how knowledge travels with people. The German brewing techniques, the Irish tea traditions, the Italian winemaking skills, all of these represent accumulated wisdom about survival, passed down through generations and across oceans. The immigrants don't always know why their traditions work, but they know that they work, and they maintain them in their new homeland. The American melting pot is also a melting pot of beverages. What will eventually emerge, the distinctive American drinking culture of the 20th century, will draw on all these traditions, combining elements from different immigrant communities into something new. But for now, in the 1840s, the traditions remain relatively distinct, each community maintaining its own practices, while observing the strange customs of its neighbours. You head back toward your lodgings, your mind full of beer and whiskey and wine and tea. The diversity of human solutions to the same problem never ceases to amaze you. Every culture has figured out how to stay hydrated, and every culture has done it differently. The solutions are local, adapted to specific conditions and available resources, but the underlying need is universal. Your explorations have taken you through many different communities and drinking cultures, but there's one population you haven't yet considered, one whose drinking options were constrained not by poverty or immigration status, but by the brutal fact of enslavement. Today, you need to confront what you've been avoiding, the experience of enslaved people when water went bad. This is not comfortable territory to explore. The records are sparse, the voices are largely silent, and the suffering is almost too great to contemplate. But understanding American history requires understanding this too. You don't have direct access to enslaved people. The South, where most enslaved Americans lived, is not where your travels have taken you. But you can learn from the accounts that have filtered north, from the testimonies of escaped enslaved people, from the observations of travellers who visited plantations and recorded what they saw. Here's the historical fact that defines the enslaved experience of hydration. Enslaved people had almost no control over their water sources. The water they drank was whatever their enslavers provided, drawn from whatever wells or streams the plantation owners chose to maintain. If those sources were contaminated, enslaved people drank contaminated water. They had no alternatives, no options, no recourse. The typical plantation had wells for the main house, and often separate inferior water sources for the enslaved quarters. These enslaved quarters were frequently located near the most undesirable parts of the property, near swamps, near waste disposal areas, near the sources of contamination that enslavers wanted to keep away from themselves. The water quality in enslaved quarters was often significantly worse than the water quality in the main house. Enslaved people recognized the dangers. The oral histories that survive often mention bad water, waterborne illness, the summer sickness that swept through the quarters, while the main house remained largely healthy. But recognition changed nothing. Enslaved people couldn't dig new wells without permission. They couldn't travel to find better water sources. They couldn't refuse to drink what was available. They drank what they were given and hoped not to die. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the brutal economics of enslaved hydration. Some enslavers gave their enslaved workers rum rations, not out of kindness but out of calculation. A daily ration of rum kept workers alive and working during the most dangerous summer months, when contaminated water might have incapacitated or killed them. The rum was an investment, a business expense, a way of protecting valuable property from the invisible dangers that even the enslavers didn't fully understand. Historians still argue about many aspects of enslaved life, but there's broad agreement that enslaved people bore the heaviest burden of waterborne disease in antebellum America. They lived in the worst conditions, drank the worst water, and died at the highest rates from typhoid and dysentery, and the various summer complaints that the era couldn't quite diagnose. The freedom that you've been enjoying throughout this journey, the freedom to choose what to drink, to seek out safer beverages, to avoid contamination when you can, was denied to millions of Americans. Enslaved people couldn't choose beer over water, couldn't visit soda fountains, couldn't escape to mineral springs resorts. They were trapped in a system that controlled every aspect of their existence, including the most basic choice about what to put in their bodies. Some enslaved people developed their own knowledge about safe beverages, passed down through generations like other survival skills. They knew which herbs to add to water, which plants could be brewed into drinks that settled stomachs and fought infection. They made beverages from whatever materials were available, Molasses and water fermented into a kind of beer, herbs steeped into teas, anything that might make the water safer, or at least more palatable. But this knowledge could only do so much within a system designed to extract maximum labour at minimum cost. The enslavers who controlled the resources weren't interested in providing safe beverages to their workforce beyond the minimum necessary to keep them alive and working. Clean water, proper wells, the infrastructure of safe hydration, these were luxuries reserved for free people. You find yourself standing on a street corner, thinking about the two Americas that coexisted in this era. The America of your travels, difficult, dangerous, but navigable if you had resources and freedom, and the other America, where millions of people lived and died without control over even the most basic necessities of survival. The story of what people drank when water went bad is incomplete if it doesn't include this dimension. The clever solutions, the improvised beverages, the creative adaptations, these were available only to those with enough freedom to choose. For enslaved Americans there were no choices, only survival or death at someone else's discretion. The summer heat continues. The contaminated water continues to flow, and in the slave quarters of the South, people continue to drink what they must and die when they must. Invisible to the historical record, their suffering absorbed into the vast silence of American amnesia. You need to move on, to continue your exploration of beverages and survival. But you carry this knowledge with you now, this awareness of who could choose and who couldn't, who lived and who died based on circumstances beyond their control. The city has begun to feel confining, and you've heard stories about the frontier, the vast territories beyond the Mississippi where Americans are pushing westward, seeking land and opportunity and escape from the crowded East. You decide to imagine yourself into that landscape, to understand what people drank when there were no wells, no taverns, no options beyond what the land itself provided. The frontier is different from anything you've experienced so far. There are no permanent settlements, or at least not many. There are no established water systems, no brewing traditions, no soda fountains or mineral springs resorts. There's just the land, vast, beautiful and unforgiving. The pioneers who crossed this territory faced drinking challenges that made urban contamination seem almost manageable. At least in the cities there were alternatives. On the frontier there was often nothing but whatever water source you could find. A river, a stream, a spring if you were lucky, a muddy puddle if you were not. Here's the historical fact that defined frontier hydration. Pioneers had to make do with whatever they encountered. The famous Oregon Trail was littered with graves, and while disease and accident claimed many lives, contaminated water contributed significantly to the death toll. Travellers would arrive at a stream or watering hole that looked clean, drink their fill, and find themselves desperately sick within days. The organisms that flourished in Western water sources were different from those in the East, but just as deadly. The solution that many pioneers adopted was simple. They drank coffee. Lots of coffee. Coffee was light enough to carry in wagon loads, kept indefinitely without spoiling, and required boiling water for preparation. A pioneer family might drink coffee at every meal, not because they loved the taste, but because it was the safest thing available. The boiling killed the pathogens that would otherwise have killed them. You imagine yourself joining a wagon train, sharing in the endless coffee that pioneers consumed. The brew would be strong and bitter, made with grounds that had been used and reused until barely any flavour remained. But it would be safe, or at least safer than the alternative. Here's a quirky detail about frontier drinking that captures the desperation of the situation. Some pioneers carried vinegar specifically for water purification. They would add vinegar to water of questionable origin, believing that the acidity would neutralise poisons. This was partially effective. Vinegar does inhibit bacterial growth, but nowhere near as effective as boiling. Still, when fuel was scarce and time was short, vinegar provided at least some protection. Historians still argue about the mortality rates on the Western trails and what proportion can be attributed to waterborne disease. Some scholars suggest that cholera and typhoid killed more pioneers than any other cause, spreading from contaminated water sources that entire wagon trains shared. Others point to accidents, Native American conflicts, and simple exhaustion as the primary killers. The truth is that all these factors combined into a gauntlet of dangers that many travellers did not survive. The mining camps that sprang up across the West had their own drinking culture, centred on whiskey as much as water. Miners worked in conditions that demanded constant hydration. But the water sources near mining operations were often contaminated by the mining itself. Chemicals, sediment, and waste from the extraction process. Whiskey was safer, or at least seemed safer, and it had the added benefit of numbing the aches and pains that mining inevitably caused. You imagine the mining camps, rough collections of tents and shanties populated by men seeking fortune in the earth. The saloons that served them were not respectable establishments, but bare-bones operations, selling whatever alcohol could be transported to these remote locations. The whiskey might be cut with water of unknown origin, might be adulterated with chemicals to increase potency, might be dangerous in ways beyond simple contamination. But the miners drank it anyway, because the alternatives were worse. Settlers who established permanent homes faced different challenges. They needed to create their own water infrastructure from scratch, digging wells, building cisterns, locating springs. The knowledge required for safe water development was often lacking, and many early settlements were plagued by contamination that the settlers couldn't identify or address. The frontier was a place where the veneer of civilization fell away, revealing the fundamental challenge of human survival. How do you stay hydrated in a land where nothing has been prepared for you, where every water source is a gamble, where there are no experts to consult and no systems to rely on? The answer was improvisation, adaptation, and luck. Some pioneers found clean springs and thrived. Others found contaminated streams and died. The land was indifferent to human welfare, and survival depended on knowledge and fortune in roughly equal measure. You return your attention to the city around you, grateful for its flawed but present infrastructure. The wells may be contaminated, the rivers may be sewers, but at least there are alternatives. The frontier offered no such comfort. The westward expansion was many things: a land grab, an economic opportunity, a spiritual journey for those who believed in manifest destiny. But it was also a public health catastrophe, a movement of people into territories where safe drinking water was impossibly scarce. The graves along the trails testify to this reality, silent monuments to the cost of quenching thirst in an unforgiving land. The frontiers made you think about another extreme environment where drinking water was scarce: the sea. Ships crossing the Atlantic brought immigrants to America, carried goods between continents, and created their own unique drinking culture, shaped by the challenge of storing water for weeks or months at sea. You make your way to the docks, where a merchant ship is preparing to depart. The captain, a weathered man with years of experience, agrees to show you how his vessel manages the drinking water problem. What you learn is both ingenious and disturbing. The water casks are stored in the hold, dozens of them, representing the ship's entire drinking supply for a voyage that might last 6 weeks or more. The casks are made of oak, carefully coopered to prevent leakage, and filled with water that was fresh when it was loaded. But that freshness doesn't last. Here's the historical fact that every sailor knew: water goes bad at sea. Within days of leaving port, the water in those casks begins to change. First, it develops a slight smell, then a taste, then a green tinge that signals the growth of organisms you'd rather not think about. By the middle of a long voyage, the water might be barely drinkable, a slimy soup that sailors force down because the alternative is dying of thirst. The solution that maritime tradition developed was grog, a mixture of water and rum that served as the standard beverage of naval and merchant vessels throughout the age of sail. The rum didn't make the water safe exactly, but it masked the worst of the taste and smell, and the alcohol had at least some antimicrobial effect. Sailors were issued grog rations twice daily, enough to sustain them through the worst stretches of the voyage. The captain shows you the rum stores nearly as extensive as the water stores. The rum is measured out carefully, diluted with the increasingly unpleasant water, and served to the crew with as much ceremony as conditions allow. The grog ration was one of the few comforts that sailors could count on, and messing with it was one of the surest ways for a captain to provoke a mutiny. Here's a quirky detail about grog that reveals the unexpected chemistry of maritime drinking. The rum and water mixture was often improved by adding lime juice. This practice, which began in the British Navy, was originally intended to prevent scurvy. The vitamin C in the lime juice protected sailors from the disease that killed more mariners than shipwrecks. But the lime juice also added acidity that further inhibited bacterial growth in the water, making the grog marginally safer, as well as more palatable. Historians still argue whether grog was a net positive or negative for maritime health. Some scholars credit the grog ration with keeping sailors hydrated and functioning during long voyages, when pure water would have been undrinkable. Others point out that the alcohol content, while relatively low, contributed to accidents and impaired judgment, and that the grog ration was one of many factors that made sailing a dangerous profession. The captain tells you about the worst voyage he ever made, crossing the Atlantic in a ship with water casks that had been improperly cleaned. Within 2 weeks, the water was so foul that even grog couldn't make it drinkable. The crew fell sick, one by one, and by the time they reached port, a quarter of the sailors were dead or dying. He learned a lesson that voyage. Water quality starts on shore, with the casks and the source, and no amount of rum can fix water that's fundamentally bad. You leave the ship and walk along the docks, watching sailors preparing for departure. They're loading supplies, checking equipment, saying goodbyes that might be final. The voyage they're about to undertake is dangerous in 100 ways, and the drinking water is just one of them. But it's a danger they accept because the sea is their livelihood, and staying on shore is not an option. The maritime world had its own solutions to the drinking problem, developed over centuries of trial and error. Grog was the most famous, but there were others: beer stored in casks, wine for officers, coconut water gathered at tropical ports, rainwater collected during storms. Each solution had its limitations, but together they formed a system that kept sailors alive during voyages that would otherwise have been impossible. The lessons of the sea eventually influenced practices on land. The idea of mixing alcohol with water to make it safer, the practice of adding acid to inhibit bacterial growth, the understanding that storage matters as much as source. All of these insights travelled from ships to shore, contributing to the broader culture of safe beverage practices. You turn away from the docks and head back into the city. The maritime world is fascinating, but it's also a reminder of how extreme the drinking challenge could become. At sea, there was no escape. You drank what the ship provided or you died. On land, at least, there were usually alternatives, even if they weren't always good ones. The sun is setting over the harbour, casting long shadows across the water. Ships are silhouetted against the fading light, their masts swaying gently in the evening breeze. Tomorrow they'll set sail, carrying their crews toward destinations unknown, trusting in grog and luck to keep them alive. It's a brave way to make a living, and a thirsty one. You've seen how ordinary people manage the drinking problem, but you're curious about what the experts thought. What did the physicians and scientists of the 1840s believe about water safety? What advice did they give to patients worried about summer sickness? You seek out a medical lecture, open to the public, where a prominent physician is scheduled to discuss summer hygiene and the prevention of disease. The lecture hall is crowded with an attentive audience, mostly middle-class people seeking guidance on how to protect themselves and their families. The physician who takes the podium is a dignified man in a dark suit, clearly accustomed to holding forth before audiences. He begins by acknowledging the suffering that summer brings: the cholera, the typhoid, the various digestive complaints that claim lives every year. His explanation of these illnesses is confident and completely wrong. Disease comes from miasma, he explains, the poisonous vapours that rise from swamps, garbage, and decaying matter. These miasmas are especially prevalent in summer, when heat accelerates the process of decay. To protect yourself from summer sickness, you must avoid miasmas by staying away from foul-smelling places and keeping your home well ventilated. Here's the historical fact that makes this lecture so poignant. The miasma theory was the dominant explanation for disease in the 1840s, accepted by most physicians and most of the educated public. It was wrong, of course. Disease is caused by germs, not smells. But it wasn't crazy wrong. Places that smelled bad were often places where disease flourished, because the same conditions that produced bad smells often produced bacterial contamination. The miasma theory was observationally correct while being mechanistically wrong. The physician moves on to discuss water. He acknowledges that some waters are healthier than others, that certain wells and springs have better reputations. But his explanation for these differences is rooted in miasma theory. Good water comes from places without foul vapours, bad water from places where miasmas have contaminated it. He recommends that families seek out water from clean sources and avoid water that smells or tastes unpleasant. This advice is actually useful, even if the reasoning is wrong. Water that smells bad is often contaminated, and avoiding it is a sensible precaution. But the advice doesn't help with water that's contaminated but doesn't smell. The clear, apparently fresh water that might still contain typhoid or cholera bacteria. The physician has no way to identify those dangers because he doesn't understand what causes them. Here's a quirky detail about medical advice in this era that captures the limits of contemporary knowledge. Some physicians recommended drinking water that had been exposed to sunlight, believing that the sun's rays would purify it. This advice had a grain of truth. UV light does kill some pathogens, but the effect was far too weak to make seriously contaminated water safe. Patients who followed this advice might have felt reassured without actually being protected. Historians still argue about how much blame physicians deserve for the public health failures of the 19th century. Some scholars point out that doctors were working with the best knowledge available to them, that the germ theory of disease was decades away, and that condemning them for not knowing what couldn't yet be known is unfair. Others note that some physicians did suspect waterborne transmission, did recommend boiling water, did question the miasma theory, and that the medical establishment was too slow to embrace these insights. The lecture continues with recommendations that sound alternately sensible and absurd from a modern perspective. Exercise in moderation, avoid extreme temperatures, maintain regular habits, don't overindulge in stimulating foods or drinks, keep your bowels regular. The advice covers everything except the actual causes of summer illness, which remain invisible to the physician and his audience alike. Someone in the audience asks about boiling water. The physician pauses, considering. Some colleagues recommend it, he admits, but he's not convinced it's necessary. Boiling removes the dissolved gases that make water pleasant to drink, and it seems unnecessary if you've selected a clean source to begin with. He doesn't recommend against boiling, but he doesn't endorse it either. This casual dismissal might be costing lives. Boiling water, really the only reliable method for making contaminated water safe, is being discussed as a minor consideration, a matter of personal preference rather than urgent necessity. The physician can't know that his equivocation is sending people home to drink water that will kill them. You leave the lecture hall feeling frustrated. The physician meant well. The audience was genuinely seeking guidance, but the guidance they received was inadequate to the actual dangers they faced. The miasma theory provided an explanation that felt scientific and actionable, but that missed the fundamental point. Disease was spreading through water, through food, through the invisible transmission of microscopic organisms that no one in this lecture hall could see or imagine. The night air is cooler now, a relief after the stuffy lecture hall. You walk through streets that are quieter than during the day, passing houses where families are preparing for sleep. In some of those houses, people are following the physician's advice, ventilating their rooms and avoiding foul smells. In others, people are drinking contaminated water that will make them sick by morning. The gap between knowledge and understanding is vast, and people are dying in that gap. Eventually, the germ theory will emerge and transform everything. But for now, the doctors are doing their best with what they know, and what they know is not enough. The medical lecture has left you thinking about the slow process of scientific change, and you find yourself dwelling on the cholera epidemics that have repeatedly swept through American cities. These epidemics are the most dramatic evidence that something is terribly wrong with the way Americans drink, even if no one yet understands exactly what. You seek out records of the 1832 epidemic, the first major cholera outbreak in America. The death toll was staggering. Thousands dead in New York alone, similar numbers in other cities. The disease moved through the population like a scythe, killing within hours or days, leaving survivors traumatized and communities decimated. Here's the historical fact that makes the cholera epidemic so significant for public health history. They forced Americans to confront the inadequacy of their water systems. Before cholera, contaminated water was a chronic problem that killed steadily but invisibly. After cholera, contaminated water was a crisis that demanded immediate attention. The epidemics created political pressure for change that chronic illness never could. The response to the epidemics was confused and often counterproductive. Some cities quarantined sick individuals, which helped somewhat. Others attempted to clean streets and remove garbage, which helped the smell but didn't address the underlying contamination. Still others relied on prayer and moral reform, believing that cholera was divine punishment for sinful behaviour. None of these responses targeted water, because no one yet understood that water was the primary transmission route. But patterns were beginning to emerge. Observant physicians noticed that cholera seemed to cluster around certain wells, certain neighbourhoods, certain water sources. They couldn't explain the mechanism, but they could see the geography. Some wells produced sickness, others didn't. Some rivers were more dangerous than others. Something about water was connected to cholera, even if the nature of that connection remained mysterious. Here's a quirky detail about the cholera epidemics that reveals the state of contemporary knowledge. Some physicians recommended drinking alcohol to prevent cholera, believing that spirits would fortify the body against disease. This advice was partially correct. Alcohol was indeed safer than contaminated water, but for the wrong reasons. The physicians thought alcohol strengthened the constitution. In reality, it simply avoided the contaminated water that was spreading the disease. Historians point to the cholera epidemics as turning points in public health consciousness. Before cholera, water quality was a private concern, a matter for individual families to manage as best they could. After cholera, water quality became a public concern, something that cities and governments had responsibility to address. The epidemics demonstrated that individual action was insufficient, that when contamination entered shared water systems, everyone was at risk. The 1849 epidemic was even worse than 1832, killing tens of thousands across the country. By then, some public health officials were beginning to suspect waterborne transmission, even without understanding the germ theory. They recommended avoiding certain water sources, boiling water before drinking, and seeking alternatives to municipal supplies. Their recommendations were not universally followed, but they represented progress toward understanding. The epidemic that would finally confirm the waterborne transmission of cholera, London's 1854 outbreak, which John Snow traced to a contaminated pump, was still in the future. But American physicians were reaching similar conclusions through their own observations. The evidence was pointing toward water, even if the theory to explain it hadn't yet crystallized. You stand on a street corner thinking about the thousands who died in the cholera epidemics. They died because they were thirsty, because they trusted their water, because no one understood the invisible dangers that lurked in every well and cistern. Their deaths were preventable with knowledge that didn't yet exist. Victims of a disease that would eventually be tamed by sanitation and clean water, the epidemics left scars on American cities that took generations to heal. Orphans from cholera families grew up without parents. Neighborhoods that lost their most productive members fell into decline. The economic and social costs were incalculable, a tax on human welfare that communities paid without understanding why. But the epidemics also created momentum for change. The same cities that suffered most severely began investing in water infrastructure, in filtration systems, in public health departments that would eventually bring the disease under control. The trauma of the epidemics was the catalyst for improvements that would save countless lives in the following decades. You head back toward your lodgings, carrying the weight of historical knowledge that the people around you don't possess. You know that cholera is waterborne, that contamination can be prevented, that the deaths need not continue. But they don't know, and they won't know for years to come. All you can do is observe and remember and appreciate the progress that will eventually arrive. The night deepens around you. Somewhere in this city, someone is drinking contaminated water that will make them a cholera statistic by the end of the week. And somewhere else, a physician is puzzling over the patterns he's observed, inching toward the insight that will eventually save millions of lives. Progress is coming, but it's taking its time. The summer is ending. You can feel it in the air. A slight cooling, a change in the quality of the light, a hint of autumn approaching. The brutal heat that drove your exploration of American drinking culture is beginning to fade, and with it the most dangerous season for waterborne disease. You've learned so much over these weeks. You've drunk beer in taverns, cider on farms, lemonade from street vendors, and coffee in boarding houses. You've seen the ice trade in action, the soda fountains dispensing their fizzy concoctions, the mineral springs where the wealthy seek health. You've met immigrants with their own traditions, examined the infrastructure of wells and cisterns, stood beside rivers that serve simultaneously as water supply and sewer. And now, as the summer closes, you witness something that points toward the future. Workers laying pipes for a municipal water system, digging trenches through city streets to install the infrastructure that will eventually bring clean water to every home. Here's the historical fact that makes this moment significant. The municipal water systems being built in the 1840s and 1850s represent the beginning of the end for the drinking crisis you've been exploring. These systems won't be perfect. The water they carry will sometimes be contaminated. The treatment will often be inadequate. But they represent a fundamental shift in approach. Water is becoming a public utility, a shared resource managed by governments rather than individuals. The era of every family digging its own well is beginning to close. The workers are muscular men, digging with shovels and picks, laying cast-iron pipes that will carry water from distant reservoirs to city neighbourhoods. The project is massive, expensive, and controversial. Some citizens object to the cost, others worry about government overreach, still others don't believe the new system will be any better than the old wells. But the work proceeds anyway, driven by the accumulated evidence of cholera epidemics and summer mortality. You watch the workers for a while, thinking about what their labour represents. This is not just infrastructure, it's a transformation in the relationship between citizens and their environment. The individual responsibility for finding safe water is being replaced by collective responsibility for providing it. The market of competing solutions, beer, cider, ice, patent medicines, will gradually give way to a public system that promises clean water for everyone. Here's a quirky detail about early municipal water that captures the transition. Some cities built ornate public fountains as showpieces for their new water systems. These fountains were monuments to civic progress, celebrations of the engineering achievements that had made clean water possible. People would gather around them to drink, to admire, to mark the transformation of their relationship with water. The fountains were both practical and symbolic, dispensing hydration and hope in equal measure. Historians point to the development of municipal water as one of the great public health achievements of the 19th century, eventually ranking alongside vaccination and sanitation in lives saved. But they also note how long the transition took, how uneven the improvements were, how many people continued to drink contaminated water decades after the technology for clean water had been developed. Progress was real but slow, and the gap between possibility and reality remained wide. The evening light is golden now, casting long shadows across the construction site. The workers are packing up their tools, preparing to continue tomorrow. The pipes they've laid will eventually carry water to homes that are currently dependent on contaminated wells. The children in those homes will grow up drinking water that won't kill them, though they'll never know how close they came to the alternative. You turn away from the construction site and walk slowly back toward your lodgings. The journey you've taken through American drinking culture is coming to an end, but the story itself is just beginning a new chapter. The era of desperate improvisation, of beer as survival strategy, of cider as medicine, of every family making its own calculations about risk and safety, is giving way to something more systematic. The solutions that individuals developed will be replaced by solutions that governments provide. It's not a simple story of progress. There will be setbacks and failures. The municipal water systems will sometimes be contaminated. The old inequalities will persist in new forms, with poor neighbourhoods receiving worse service than rich ones. The achievement of universal clean water will take another century, and even then it won't be quite universal. But the direction is clear. The suffering you've witnessed, the cholera deaths, the summer complaints, the children killed by contaminated milk, will eventually become rare, then unthinkable. The elaborate culture of alternative beverages will fade as clean water becomes ordinary. The knowledge you've gathered about survival strategies will become historical curiosity rather than practical necessity. The night arrives as you reach your lodgings. One more night in this strange summer journey, one more evening of thinking about what you've learned. Tomorrow you'll return to your own time, carrying the memory of a world where drinking water was a gamble and staying hydrated was an achievement. But tonight, you rest, and as you drift towards sleep, the sounds of the city fade around you. The distant clatter of construction, the murmur of voices, the rhythm of a world that's slowly, painfully, learning how to keep its people alive. The night deepens softly now, like water settling in a still glass. The sounds outside your window grow quieter, more distant, dissolving into the gentle hum of a city at rest. The heat that drove you through these streets has lifted, and a cool breeze drifts through your room carrying the first whisper of the autumn, the promise of relief. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift like leaves floating on a gentle stream. The cholera epidemics, the contaminated wells, the desperate choices, these were real, these were hard, but they're fading now into history's soft twilight. The people of that era found their ways to survive, just as people always do. They drank their beer and their cider, their coffee and their switchel. They adapted, they improvised, They kept each other alive through summers that tried to kill them, and now the workers are building something better. Pipes are being laid, reservoirs are being filled, a future is taking shape where water won't be a gamble anymore. The children of tomorrow will drink without fear, will turn taps without wondering if what comes out will hurt them. It's happening slowly, like dawn approaching, but it's happening. Let that thought carry you towards sleep. The thought of problems being solved, of suffering being eased, of human ingenuity finding answers that seemed impossible just a generation before. The world is getting better, one pipe at a time, one discovery at a time, one patient worker at a time. The breeze continues to whisper through your window. Somewhere distant, a bell chimes softly, marking the hour, telling the city that another day has ended safely. You made it through this summer. Millions of others did too. And tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after, the story continues. The endless human story of thirst and satisfaction, danger and safety, problems and solutions. Sleep now. Let the worries of the past fade into dreams of the future. The water is getting cleaner, the days are getting cooler, and you've earned this rest, this peace, this gentle descent into sleep. Sweet dreams. But the epidemics also created momentum for change. The same cities that suffered most severely began investing in water infrastructure, in filtration systems, in public health departments that would eventually bring the disease under control. The trauma of the epidemics was the catalyst for improvements that would save countless lives in the following decades. You head back toward your lodgings, carrying the weight of historical knowledge that the people around you don't possess. You know that cholera is waterborne, that contamination can be prevented, that the deaths need not continue. But they don't know, and they won't know for years to come. All you can do is observe and remember and appreciate the progress that will eventually arrive. The night deepens around you. Somewhere in this city, someone is drinking contaminated water that will make them a cholera statistic by the end of the week. And somewhere else, a physician is puzzling over the patterns he's observed, inching toward the insight that will eventually save millions of lives. Progress is coming, but it's taking its time. The summer is ending. You can feel it in the air, a slight cooling, a change in the quality of the light, a hint of autumn approaching. The brutal heat that drove your exploration of American drinking culture is beginning to fade, and with it the most dangerous season for waterborne disease. You've learned so much over these weeks. You've drunk beer in taverns, cider on farms, lemonade from street vendors, and coffee in boarding houses. You've seen the ice trade in action, the soda fountains dispensing their fizzy concoctions, the mineral springs where the wealthy seek health. You've met immigrants with their own traditions, examined the infrastructure of wells and cisterns, stood beside rivers that serve simultaneously as water supply and sewer. And now, as the summer closes, you witness something that points toward the future. Workers laying pipes for a municipal water system, digging trenches through city streets to install the infrastructure that will eventually bring clean water to every home. Here's the historical fact that makes this moment significant. The municipal water systems being built in the 1840s and 1850s represent the beginning of the end for the drinking crisis you've been exploring. These systems won't be perfect. The water they carry will sometimes be contaminated, the treatment will often be inadequate, but they represent a fundamental shift in approach. Water is becoming a public utility, a shared resource managed by governments rather than individuals. The era of every family digging its own well is beginning to close. The workers are muscular men, digging with shovels and picks, laying cast iron pipes that will carry water from distant reservoirs to city neighbourhoods. The project is massive, expensive, and controversial. Some citizens object to the cost, others worry about government overreach, still others don't believe the new system will be any better than the old wells. But the work proceeds anyway, driven by the accumulated evidence of cholera epidemics and summer mortality. You watch the workers for a while, thinking about what their labour represents. This is not just infrastructure, it's a transformation in the relationship between citizens and their environment. The individual responsibility for finding safe water is being replaced by collective responsibility for providing it. The market of competing solutions, beer, cider, ice, patent medicines, will gradually give way to a public system that promises clean water for everyone. Here's a quirky detail about early municipal water that captures the transition. Some cities built ornate public fountains as showpieces for their new water systems. These fountains were monuments to civic progress, celebrations of the engineering achievements that had made clean water possible. People would gather around them to drink, to admire, to mark the transformation of their relationship with water. The fountains were both practical and symbolic, dispensing hydration and hope in equal measure. Historians point to the development of municipal water as one of the great public health achievements of the 19th century, eventually ranking alongside vaccination and sanitation in lives saved. But they also note how long the transition took, how uneven the improvements were, how many people continued to drink contaminated water decades after the technology for clean water had been developed. Progress was real, but slow, and the gap between possibility and reality remained wide. The evening light is golden now, casting long shadows across the construction site. The workers are packing up their tools, preparing to continue tomorrow. The pipes they've laid will eventually carry water to homes that are currently dependent on contaminated wells. The children in those homes will grow up drinking water that won't kill them, though they'll never know how close they came to the alternative. You turn away from the construction site and walk slowly back toward your lodgings. The journey you've taken through American drinking culture is coming to an end, but the story itself is just beginning a new chapter. The year of desperate improvisation, of beer as survival strategy, of cider as medicine, of every family making its own calculations about risk and safety, is giving way to something more systematic. The solutions that individuals developed will be replaced by solutions that governments provide. It's not a simple story of progress. There will be setbacks and failures. The municipal water systems will sometimes be contaminated. The old inequalities will persist in new forms, with poor neighbourhoods receiving worse service than rich ones. The achievement of universal clean water will take another century, and even then it won't be quite universal. But the direction is clear. The suffering you've witnessed, the cholera deaths, the summer complaints, the children killed by contaminated milk, will eventually become rare, then unthinkable. The elaborate culture of alternative beverages will fade as clean water becomes ordinary. The knowledge you've gathered about survival strategies will become historical curiosity rather than practical necessity. The night arrives as you reach your lodgings. One more night in this strange summer journey, one more evening of thinking about what you've learned. Tomorrow you'll return to your own time, carrying the memory of a world where drinking water was a gamble and staying hydrated was an achievement. But tonight, you rest. And as you drift towards sleep, the sounds of the city fade around you, the distant clatter of construction, the murmur of voices, the rhythm of a world that's slowly, painfully, learning how to keep its people alive. The night deepens softly now, like water settling in a still glass. The sounds outside your window grow quieter, more distant, dissolving into the gentle hum of a city at rest. The heat that drove you through these streets has lifted, and a cool breeze drifts through your room, carrying the first whisper of autumn, the promise of relief. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift like leaves floating on a gentle stream. The cholera epidemics, the contaminated wells, the desperate choices. These were real. These were hard, but they're fading now into history's soft twilight. The people of that era found their ways to survive, just as people always do. They drank their beer and their cider, their coffee and their switchel. They adapted, they improvised, they kept each other alive through summers that tried to kill them. And now the workers are building something better. Pipes are being laid, reservoirs are being filled, a future is taking shape where water won't be a gamble anymore. The children of tomorrow will drink without fear, will turn taps without wondering if what comes out will hurt them. It's happening slowly, like dawn approaching, but it's happening. Let that thought carry you towards sleep. The thought of problems being solved, of suffering being eased, of human ingenuity finding answers that seemed impossible just a generation before. The world is getting better, one pipe at a time, one discovery at a time, one patient worker at a time. The breeze continues to whisper through your window. Somewhere distant, a bell chimes softly, marking the hour, telling the city that another day has ended safely. You made it through this summer. Millions of others did too. And tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after, the story continues. The endless human story of thirst and satisfaction, danger and safety, problems and solutions. Sleep now. Let the worries of the past fade into dreams of the future. The water is getting cleaner, the The days are getting cooler, and you've earned this rest, this peace, this gentle descent into sleep. Sweet dreams. The epidemics left scars on American cities that took generations to heal. Orphans from cholera families grew up without parents. Neighborhoods that lost their most productive members fell into decline. The economic and social costs were incalculable, a tax on human welfare that communities paid without understanding why. But the epidemics also created momentum for change. The same cities that suffered most severely began investing in water infrastructure, in filtration systems, in public health departments that would eventually bring the disease under control. The trauma of the epidemics was the catalyst for improvements that would save countless lives in the following decades. You head back toward your lodgings, carrying the weight of historical knowledge that the people around you don't possess. You know that cholera is waterborne, that contamination can be prevented, that the deaths need not continue. But they don't know, and they won't know for years to come. All you can do is observe and remember and appreciate the progress that will eventually arrive. The night deepens around you. Somewhere in this city, someone is drinking contaminated water that will make them a cholera statistic by the end of the week. And somewhere else, a physician is puzzling over the patterns he's observed, inching toward the insight that will eventually save millions of lives. Progress is coming, but it's taking its time. The summer is ending. You can feel it in the air. A slight cooling, a change in the quality of the light, a hint of autumn approaching. The brutal heat that drove your exploration of American drinking culture is beginning to fade, and with it the most dangerous season for waterborne disease. You've learned so much over these weeks. You've drunk beer in taverns, cider on farms, lemonade from street vendors, and coffee in boarding houses. You've seen the ice trade in action, the soda fountains dispensing their fizzy concoctions, the mineral springs where the wealthy seek health. You've met immigrants with their own traditions, examined the infrastructure of wells and cisterns, stood beside rivers that serve simultaneously as water supply and sewer. And now, as the summer closes, you witness something that points toward the future. Workers laying pipes for a municipal water system, digging trenches through city streets to install the infrastructure that will eventually bring clean water to every home. Here's the historical fact that makes this moment significant. The municipal water systems being built in the 1840s and 1850s represent the beginning of the end for the drinking crisis you've been exploring. These systems won't be perfect. The water they carry will sometimes be contaminated. The treatment will often be inadequate. But they represent a fundamental shift in approach. Water is becoming a public utility, a shared resource managed by governments rather than individuals. The era of every family digging its own well is beginning to close. The workers are muscular men, digging with shovels and picks, laying cast iron pipes that will carry water from distant reservoirs to city neighbourhoods. The project is massive, expensive, and controversial. Some citizens object to the cost, others worry about government overreach, still others don't believe the new system will be any better than the old wells. But the work proceeds anyway, driven by the accumulated evidence of cholera epidemics and summer mortality. You watch the workers for a while, thinking about what their labour represents. This is not just infrastructure, it's a transformation in the relationship between citizens and their environment. The individual responsibility for finding safe water is being replaced by collective responsibility for providing it. The market of competing solutions, beer, cider, ice, patent medicines, will gradually give way to a public system that promises clean water for everyone. Here's a quirky detail about early municipal water that captures the transition. Some cities built ornate public fountains as showpieces for their new water systems. These fountains were monuments to civic progress, celebrations of the engineering achievements that had made clean water possible. People would gather around them to drink, to admire, to mark the transformation of their relationship with water. The fountains were both practical and symbolic, dispensing hydration and hope in equal measure. Historians point to the development of municipal water as one of the great public health achievements of the 19th century, eventually ranking alongside vaccination and sanitation in lives saved. But they also note how long the transition took, how uneven the improvements were, how many people continued to drink contaminated water decades after the technology for clean water had been developed. Progress was real but slow, and the gap between possibility and reality remained wide. The evening light is golden now, casting long shadows across the construction site. The workers are packing up their tools, preparing to continue tomorrow. The pipes they've laid will eventually carry water to homes that are currently dependent on contaminated wells. The children in those homes will grow up drinking water that won't kill them, though they'll never know how close they came to the alternative. You turn away from the construction site and walk slowly back toward your lodgings. The journey you've taken through American drinking culture is coming to an end, but the story itself is just beginning a new chapter. The era of desperate improvisation, of beer as survival strategy, of cider as medicine, of every family making its own calculations about risk and safety, is giving way to something more systematic. The solutions that individuals developed will be replaced by solutions that governments provide. It's not a simple story of progress. There will be setbacks and failures. The municipal water systems will sometimes be contaminated. The old inequalities will persist in new forms, with poor neighbourhoods receiving worse service than rich ones. The achievement of universal clean water will take another century, and even then it won't be quite universal. But the direction is clear. The suffering you've witnessed, the cholera deaths, the summer complaints, the children killed by contaminated milk, will eventually become rare, then unthinkable. The elaborate culture of alternative beverages will fade as clean water becomes ordinary. The knowledge you've gathered about survival strategies will become historical curiosity rather than practical necessity. The night arrives as you reach your lodgings. One more night in this strange summer journey, one more evening of thinking about what you've learned. Tomorrow you'll return to your own time, carrying the memory of a world where drinking water was a gamble and staying hydrated was an achievement. But tonight, you rest, and as you drift towards sleep, the sounds of the city fade around you. The distant clatter of construction, the murmur of voices, the rhythm of a world that's slowly, painfully, learning how to keep its people alive. The night deepens softly now, like water settling in a still glass. The sounds outside your window grow quieter, more distant, dissolving into the gentle hum of a city at rest. The heat that drove you through these streets has lifted, and a cool breeze drifts through your room carrying the first whisper of the autumn, the promise of relief. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift like leaves floating on a gentle stream. The cholera epidemics, the contaminated wells, the desperate choices, these were real, these were hard, but they're fading now into history's soft twilight. The people of that era found their ways to survive, just as people always do. They drank their beer and their cider, their coffee and their switchel. They adapted, they improvised, they kept each other alive through summers that tried to kill them. And now the workers are building something better. Pipes are being laid, reservoirs are being filled, a future is taking shape where water won't be a gamble anymore. The children of tomorrow will drink without fear, will turn taps without wondering if what comes out will hurt them. It's happening slowly, like dawn approaching, but it's happening. Let that thought carry you towards sleep. The thought of problems being solved, of suffering being eased, of human ingenuity finding answers that seemed impossible just a generation before. The world is getting better, one pipe at a time, one discovery at a time, one patient worker at a time. The breeze continues to whisper through your window. Somewhere distant, a bell chimes softly, marking the hour, telling the city that another day has ended safely. You made it through this summer. Millions of others did too. And tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after, the story continues. The endless human story of thirst and satisfaction, danger and safety, problems and solutions. Sleep now. Let the worries of the past fade into dreams of the future. The water is getting cleaner, the days are getting cooler, and you've earned this rest, this peace, this gentle descent into sleep. Sweet dreams.